Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you had a quick but nice lunch. I managed to get a little something in, but you guys can eat in front of the computer. It's going to be a little problem for me. So what we're going to do this afternoon is we're going to cover how to know a good deal from a bad deal. We're going to talk about how to inspect a property and then about managing tenants. Three very critical areas that you're going to want to know. Now, what I did is I opened up a box on your window, window on your computer, I should say, that has the link to our free online course. I've also put it in the chat box in case you're not seeing that. Now, normally we sell that course for $297. It parallels this course. It's 7 hours, soup to nuts. It covers everything. And what we're going to do is you can feel free to use that or download that for yourself, sign up for that for yourself. And we're going to go a little crazy today and say, look, if you want to spread it around, if you want to give it to your friends, if you want to post it, we don't care. I've had a real good 2014, so I'm in a great mood. So let's go ahead. And if you want to spread it around and let other people sign up for free for one of our normally $297 courses, I don't care. So go for it, have fun, and why don't we go ahead and we'll get started for this afternoon. And I'm going to start sharing my screen again. And we're going to go ahead and get started on how to tell if you've got a good deal from a bad deal. Now, a lot of people say, well, Tom, that's all well and good. You know, thanks so much for teaching me all this. But how do I really know if I like a good deal from a bad deal? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through 3 examples that show you a good deal from a bad deal and gives you some overview on things that you're going to want to be looking for. Now, in real estate investing, you can be bad at everything else, but not the analysis. Remember, the analysis, figuring the numbers, is where you actually make your money. Honestly, that's why a lot of people actually hire us as their coach, because they want to run the deals past us, and we'll do an analysis on them as well to make sure that what they're doing is right and that they're not going to get into something that's going to be a problem for them down the road. Because your success or failure is in the numbers. And remember, you need to verify the rents, verify the leases, and verify disclosed expenses. You also need to look for undisclosed expenses or deferred maintenance. Undisclosed expenses is, oh, we signed a cable contract and the landlord's responsible for $300 a month for all the units, but we forgot to mention that. Those are the types of expenses that can really haunt you and create some real insecurity in your cash flow. And you also want to watch for deferred maintenance. Deferred maintenance is one of those things that the landlord, the seller, is going to try to gloss over. Oh, it needs new carpet, that's cheap. Or it's going to need a new roof, that's no problem. Well, if it isn't a problem, then at the price they're asking, if the numbers look good, let them do the repairs, and then you'll buy it. But what I have found is that people, when they say, oh, it's not a problem, usually it's a pretty big number. So you need to know what that is. And don't forget to add in that vacancy factor. All too many times people forget that, and the reserve fund. If you don't add in for the reserve fund and long-term maintenance and updates, at some point you're going to get a bill for $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, and you're not going to have the cash. But if you've been putting it aside, like I suggest, a couple of things happens. One is you got the cash. And 2, think about this. You go to the bank. The bank wants to see your bank statements. You've got a couple properties. Let's say you've got 2-4 units, and you've got $10,000 in your reserve fund. The bank's going to look at that, look down at the sheet, look up at you and think, this person knows how to manage a property. And that puts you in an entirely different light compared to other people who walk in. So when you run it like a business, you treat it like a business, you have reserves, it's going to go a long way to making you a wealthy person down the road, because people are going to consider you a professional, knowledgeable, and are going to want to borrow you money. You also want to see if taxes are going to be changed on the purchase. In a lot of areas, if you buy a property and you pay less than tax assessment for it, now remember, appraised is what the bank says it's worth, assessed is what they say it's worth for tax purposes. If for some reason you go ahead and buy the property and aren't careful about checking your taxes, you're going to find that you're going to be in a bit of a problem, a bit of a pickle here. And I think I forgot to turn on the power on a share here. 1 second here. We had to reboot everything, and sometimes there are those days when you just want to shake your head and go, Yeah, the technology just is not everything it's supposed to be. So once again, I apologize for that. It is one of those situations you don't like, but you've got to live with. One second here, ladies and gentlemen. I apologize. I'm still trying to get this set up a little bit. Close out a couple of windows here. It is giving us a little bit of grief today. Hence us giving you the free module. So, like I said, you can be bad at everything else, but not the computer. It's funny how that goes sometimes. You sometimes got to laugh at yourself when the technology doesn't work. But you also want to make sure that you have your zoning right. What I have seen is that I've seen that the zoning is not done right, and you're going to have some real problems down the road. For instance, it's zoned for single family, and somebody has in the past come back and actually turned it into a multifamily. That creates some real problems for you down the road when the investor, when they come in and they tell you that, well, that's not going to work. You're going to actually have to turn it back into a non-investor owned property. So a good deal, let's talk about a good deal for an investor owner occupant. Let's say you've got total rents of about $29,000 and we put in a 10% vacancy factor. The expenses are $6,200 per year. Remember, reserve fund is $2,964. That's 10% for the vacancy factor, 10% for reserve. And we have an upfront maintenance cost of $5,000. Let's say it needs a few new windows, and that's an expense we're going to have to take care of right up front. So the net operating income on this particular year is $17,512. And let's say, in this case, we're putting 20% down and we're paying $168,000. What happens is you've got a down payment of $33,600. That's 20% of 168, and your payment is $774 per month, or $9,200 approximately, and that's at 5.625%. If you own or occupy right now, that rate's going to be a little lower, but otherwise it's going to be about there. So you got a net operating income of $8,244. All right, that's not bad. And so your cash on cash return, you've got a cash flow of $8,244. Your net operating income is $17,512. Your payment is $9,288. You've got $8,244. When you divide that by your down payment, your cash on cash return is 24.5%, which is very good. Now that would work as either an owner occupant property or as an investor property. And if you owner occupy with 5% down and have a 4.5% owner occupant rate, your payment goes up to $9,850 a year from $9,288, but you're still living for free, even if you live in one unit of the four, and you put $252 a month in your pocket. So that is a great deal. Marginal deal here is, let's say your rents were $30,000 vacancy, because that's what history is showing this particular property is doing. And our expenses are $7,800 per year. We're putting in $3,000 in reserve fund. It gives us an NOI of $18,000. But let's say we're paying $350,000, but we are only putting down 5%. So that's still $17,500. It's a significant amount. Your payment is $1,762 per month, or $21,000 a year. Now that's at 4.75%. So when you subtract the payment from the net operating income, you're actually upside down about $3,000 a month, or you're paying $258 a month. But if that's all you're paying and you're building equity in a property that you're actually living in, that's not a terrible situation. Plus, when you move out and rent that unit at market rate, it's actually going to cash flow pretty well. Now, what I usually recommend is that you're living in a property, I usually recommend you actually make the payment like you were renting it. because that way when you go to the bank down the road to refinance it or to do another deal, the bank's going to look at that and go, wow, okay, these numbers look good. If you say, well, I was living in one unit, it kind of puts a black blemish on your credibility, because it says they're not running it like a business, they're not treating it seriously. So I always recommend making the rent payment, and then you can pay yourself the cash, but at least show it as profit in the business and then pay yourself the cash. Now, this does not include PMI, which can be significant. On $300,000, your PMI could be $200 or $300 a month. So do keep in mind that that's going to change things. And it doesn't include depreciation. When you look at depreciation on a property like this, it might give you a reduction in your income of $10,000. For instance, at $350,000, 25% of that, let's say, being land value, or 20% of that being land value, you've got a building value of $280,000. If you're depreciating that over 27.5 years, you've got a depreciation of $10,000, but you get a credit on your taxes of $7,600, because you can't count the occupied unit, the unit you actually live in. But if you talk to your accountant, that can reduce your taxable income significantly and make it that much better of a deal. Now, B neighborhood, this is a bad deal. I've actually looked at this particular property. Total rent of $30,000, vacancy factor of $3,000, expenses of $6,600, the reserve fund of $3,000, and it's got a net operating income of $18,000. Not very strong considering the asking price is $420,000. Plus, it needed immediate repairs of $5,000. Now, when you go ahead and start making that payment, the down payment on that thing is $84,000, and the payment is almost $23,000 a year. When you look at the payment versus the NOI, the payment is going to be $22,000. You're going to be losing $4,450 a year on this particular property. And that's before any unanticipated expenses. So when you've put $84,000 into this thing, and you're losing $4,450, you've got a negative return of 5.3% on your investment. Well, that type of property is going to eat you, and I can certainly counsel you on where to find better deals than that. Now, when you negotiate the deal, you need to look at a lot of properties starting out, and remember, learn what level of quality the tenants are expecting. An A tenant is going to expect something different than a C tenant, and learn what updates may be necessary and plan on making those updates and how much it's going to cost. Build that into your asking price and your business model, so that you know what you're going to have to fix down the road. And don't be afraid to ask. Don't be afraid to look a little silly now and then. If you don't know, ask. I mean, that's the only way you're going to learn. And you got to practice. You got to look at a ton of properties if you really want to be successful in this business. I also suggest studying some great negotiators. You can go to Google and just put in negotiating tactics. You can go to any of the Amazon and type in great negotiators and negotiating books, and find all kinds of books on how to negotiate. And you need to become a student of real estate and people, and really treat it like a business, something that you want to do long term. Now, realtors there's two types basically: great negotiators and order takers. Most realtors are order takers. They'll ask you, what do you want to offer? And they won't provide a lot of advice. And if you want to give them a lower offer, in many cases, they don't want to do that because they think the seller is going to balk and kick and not accept. Well, they may be right, but it's always possible to come back up, but it's not really easy to lower the price as you go. It's a lot tougher. So there's MLS versus for sale by owner. The MLS is the multiple listing services where all the realtors post their listings, and the for sale by owner are often separate sites that don't post to the MLS. Now, some for sale by owners do post to the MLS, so keep in mind that you'll sometimes find them there. So all the realtor properties are listed in some FSBO, and the realtors, if you're using a realtor, will negotiate the deal for you. That's why I said you wanted somebody who was experienced in multifamily, and somebody that you feel comfortable is actually going to look out for your best interest and not just want to make a deal and it doesn't matter whether you do well or not. Now, realtors can give you MLS access at different levels. Generally, they won't give you a realtor at level access because that has some information that's proprietary, and they can actually get into a lot of trouble for giving you that access. So you want an experienced multifamily realtor, and you want to focus on the numbers solely. Remember, don't worry about the appreciation. That's something that you look at as a bonus. When you see for sale by owners, the reason people go FSBO typically is they're trying to save commissions. And I've seen FSBO properties that are overpriced, grossly overpriced. People have an overinflated sense of what the house is worth, or in some cases underpriced. And if you find an underpriced for sale by owner, you have no obligation to tell them that they're underpriced. Just go ahead and do the deal. Now, the FSBOs, remember, are not always on the MLS, so go to FSBO, your city, and check that and make sure that you're checking the FSBO sites as well. But on a for sale by owner, you generally negotiate directly with the seller or the seller's attorney. When you have a for sale by owner, you want to put in a clause on your offer that says it's subject to attorney approval, because within, let's say, 5 days or 10 days. Because if you get a deal done and you're inexperienced, you want to make sure your attorney looks at that. You don't necessarily want to spend the money going in, but you definitely want to do it before you actually have a firm deal, because that gives you an out should you need to get out. You also want to do your own research and check on the sales history of similar homes. And you can do this on Realtor.com. Trulia, all these different ones do have Zillow, have a history of recent closings in those neighborhoods, and that'll give you an idea of what similar properties are selling for. You can also go online and check the tax assessments and find out what the properties are selling for. Tax assessment, remember, is what it says it's worth for property tax purposes. But when you look at an area, normally you'll see the assessments tend to cluster in one price range. And you'll see that properties are almost all selling over assessment. Let's say they're all selling 20,000 over assessed, or they're all selling at assessment, or they're all selling under. It just gives you a little bit of a feel for what's going on in that particular market and where a good price might be. And the terms of the deal is where you get to ask the contract for what you want. And you obviously want to ask for more than you hope to get. And you have to have areas in which you're going to be flexible and areas in which you're not flexible. For instance, you might be flexible on the terms. What closing date do they want? What items are included? You need to make sure you ask for the appliances and anything else that you're going to want included in the deal. You're going to want to put in your price. You're going to want to, I like to start about 10% below my final price, where I could actually go to and start there. But you got to be willing to give to get, and you got to understand the seller's mindset and what are they trying to accomplish. So you've got to be reasonable. You can start lowballing people, and that's fine. You will develop a bit of a reputation, and in some cases, people won't take you seriously if you're dealing with what they feel is in bad faith. But if you find a good deal, be reasonable in it and do the deal. I've seen people argue over $500 and lose a deal that would have made them thousands, tens of thousands. Now, one of the things you want to negotiate for is the closing date after the 5th of the month. And the reason is that after the 5th of the month, you're not going to have a payment the 1st of the following month. For instance, let's say we close June 6th. You're not going to have a payment July 1st. You're not going to have a payment till August 1st. So what does that mean? I get most of June's rent because at the closing, you get prorated rents for the part of the month you own it. So if we close on the 6th, I get all the rents for June except 6 days or 5 days. I get the 6-day rent because we're closing on the 6th. I also get July and August before I have a first payment due. Now, so you've got 3 payments right there, which can help make any updates and quick repairs, and you have a little cash to put into your reserve fund. Now, on the rents, when you close on the 6th, if the landlord hasn't collected the rents, I don't care what their excuse is, they still have to credit you the rent at the closing table. They can't say, well, you can get it from the tenant. No way, Jose. They pay it at the closing table. If the tenant's late, it's their problem. Now, when the tenant does pay, you can reimburse the seller if you choose, or you might not. It kind of depends. But I do not close if the seller does not credit me the rent. The fact that the tenant hasn't paid is their problem. They haven't trained their tenants right, and I'm not going to have to go chasing that money that they're supposed to provide. Also, as I mentioned, there's no payments due. So 3 months of rent before the first payment, and make sure that all the security deposits are transferred and held according to the law. Some places have security deposits of 1 month's rent. Some places are 2. Some places are $1 or $100. Some places have no security deposits. Most places, states, or local areas have rules about what you have to hold or how you have to hold that. Some places you can put it right in your basic checking account, the security deposit. Other places it's got to be in a segregated account. So make sure you know how that's got to be handled, because that can get you in a ton of trouble with the government authorities. And make sure you change over the utilities. The utilities are one of those things that you want to make sure and get transferred over into your name if the utilities are in the landlord's name. Generally, you want to buy properties where the utilities are in the tenant's name versus your name, because you'd rather have them paying the utilities. They'll use a lot less if it's them paying the bill. In a fast moving market, if the market's really starting to heat up, I only like to give the person anywhere from, several hours to 1 day to respond, because what's going to happen is the second you put an offer in, the seller is going to tell everybody else who had an interest in the property that there's an offer on the table. And if they're interested, they should put their offer in. That can create a situation where you got multiple email or multiple offers. And now you get into a bidding war, which is not a place you want to be. You want to make sure that you can respond via email. So make sure that that's in the offer, that you'll do the deal via email. Keep copies of all correspondence. Private sellers, what I like to do is I usually give them 24, no more than 48 hours. Bank-owned properties, on the other hand, they're going to take as long as they want. You can put in whatever you want, but what I'll usually do is if it's listed by a realtor and it's bank-owned, I'll usually call the realtor and find out how much time the bank needs to respond and use that. Frankly, the bank doesn't give a darn what you think or what you say or what you do. They're going to respond in their own good time. And that goes with government-owned properties too. So be aware that if it's a private seller, the seller is going to be, and the selling realtor is going to be shopping your deal. So you want to limit the time so that they can't shop you against everybody else and try to use your offer to leverage up. Now, earnest money is basically a security deposit. And it varies depending on normal practice in your area. And in some areas where we are, it's pretty minimal. $200,000 property, it might have a $1,000 or $2,000 security deposit, or I'm sorry, earnest money deposit. Some places they want 10%. But I never pay the earnest money. I only do it when the offer is accepted, because if you send the earnest money and they don't accept it, they're going to deposit that check. And then that check's going to go through their bank account, and then it's got to be cut. It might be 2 weeks till you see your money back. And if they're unscrupulous, it might be longer than that. So I do not give any cash at the offer, only upon acceptance. And I ask for 3 business days to deposit the earnest money. You always want to make the earnest money out to the title company or the real estate company trust account. You do not make it out to an individual. You do not make it out to the realtor unless it says trust account behind it. And you never give it to the seller. If it's a for sale by owner, have your attorney hold the funds, because that way they can't hold you hostage if the deal doesn't go through. On short sales, as we talked about earlier, I like to give $50 to $100, not much, just enough to consummate the deal. And I do the same typically on bank and government-owned properties. They will often have in there how much earnest money is required. In many cases, it's going to be just a percentage of the value of the property that they're going to want. So you'll need to know that, and that'll be disclosed typically on the MLS sheet. On the inspection, this is your opportunity to check out the property. And you want to look at the neighborhood and nearby properties and find out what they're looking like as far as what the condition they're in, the physical condition of the property. You want to look at the exterior. You want to look at the roof, siding, windows, grade, landscaping, because those are the things that are going to determine whether you get good tenants and keep good tenants. On the interior, and we're going to go into these in detail on the next module, but in the interior, you want to look at the mechanicals, the heating, the air conditioning, the electric, the plumbing. You want to go through baths and kitchens, foundation. You want to look at the general condition and determine what kind of condition that property's in. I like to do that and figure that into my offer. Later, once we get an accepted offer, we're going to do a formal inspection and have a third party look at it. And if we find things we didn't expect, then we'll go back and try to renegotiate the deal. But these are things that you're going to want to be looking at when you're walking to the property, and make sure that you negotiate that into your offer price up front. It's a lot easier to do it on the front end than to come back later. Now, when you do an inspection on a property after you have an accepted offer, if you find something significant, it's called a defect. And if it is a defect, what you need to do is go back to the seller and try to renegotiate the deal. I always say something like, Mr. Seller, our offer was based on the property being in this condition, and we found that the furnace isn't working, and we're going to need to replace the furnace. We would, as you know, we've tried to make the deal based on a certain number, which you accepted. So we'd like you to fix the furnace so that those numbers stay the same. And in many cases, they will, because if they don't fix it, in many cases, they have to disclose it on the property condition report anyway to any new prospective buyer. And then those prospective buyers are going to require them to fix it anyway. So when you disclose a problem like that, generally under the law, they've got to disclose to prospective buyers, which means in many cases, they're just going to fix it to keep the deal alive. Now, depending on where you're located, tests are different than inspections. An inspection is a visual inspection. They can't take measurements or tests. Test is different. And if you want to test, you want to specify it in your offer to purchase. And the things that I typically see people test for is radon gas. And radon is from the decay of granite rocks in the soil. And depending on your area, it may or may not be present. It's pretty inexpensive to mitigate if it is a problem. But generally, if you want to do a test on radon, you got to ask for that. Lead and lead tests depend on the regulations in your state. Some states and municipalities require you to take lead-based paint out. And if that's the case, that is a huge number. That can break you in itself. So you want to know what your area requires as far as lead. And then if there's major expenses involving lead in your area, you definitely want to test for it. And pests are kind of location dependent. There's also asbestos tests. Older properties, a lot of them do have asbestos. Asbestos, there's some places require it to be removed. Other places, the way we usually do it here is we encapsulate it. We just wrap it in a type of material, and that's considered abatement in our area. Mold, people are all panicked about mold. Every house has mold. It really depends on where it's located, how significant, things like that, and other contaminants. So its tests are different than inspections. So keep that in mind to make sure you specify that in your offer to purchase. Make sure your financing contingency is in there, and it lays out the contingency you give is the worst terms under which you'll do the deal. So it's going to say, what is the maximum down payment you're going to pay? What is the maximum interest rate you'll pay? What is the maximum upfront cost, the minimum term of financing, and what happens if there's no financing available? In some states, if there's no financing available, the seller can actually finance it. I've never seen that happen, but in some states that's allowed. However, you want to make sure that you specify those items, because if all of a sudden your interest rate is 6% and you had planned on 4%, you can actually get out of the transaction. If the financing isn't available, the buyers cancel, and you're generally entitled to get your earnest money deposit back, because one of the contingencies in any offer is you want to put in a financing contingency. If you can't get financing, that contingency can't be satisfied. In most cases, the buyer's entitled to get their money back. So keep in mind that the financing contingency is one of those ways you protect yourself from buying a property that you can't afford. Now, an appraisal is necessary if you're financing with a bank. They're going to require it, and the lender is going to order an appraisal from a third party. You're going to pay for it, usually as part of the closing costs, but they're going to order it and get the appraisal. And it's got to be completed prior to the financing contingency expiring, because think about this. Your financing contingency expires, which says you're going to buy the property, but you still got an appraisal contingency, and the appraisal doesn't come back and it appraises for less than you offered. Well, now you're in a bit of a pickle. That's one of those cases where you got to get some legal advice on what you can actually do. So you want that appraisal to come back for at least what you're paying, and definitely come back before the financing contingency, because if the appraisal comes back and it appraises for less than you've offered, you have some options. You as a buyer can go back to the seller and say, Mr. Seller, Mrs. Seller, the property appraised for $10,000 less than what you're offering, or than what we offered. We'd like you to lower the price to that, and then we'll continue with the deal. And the seller can say yes or no. If the seller says no, the buyer, you as the buyer can then cancel and not do the deal. If you say you still want the property and they won't come down, basically you've got to bring that extra cash to the closing table, because the bank's not going to borrow it to you. So the seller has options too. The seller can say, yes, we'll lower the price, or no, we won't. In most cases, I find the seller does lower down to the appraised value, because what's going to happen is that the appraisal goes into a national database nowadays, which means when a new appraisal, somebody else comes along, they don't sell it to you because your appraisal came back light. A new appraisal is done for a new buyer. They're going to see that old appraisal. And generally, appraisers aren't going to want to appraise, especially let's say it's a month later. They're not going to want to appraise much over that last appraisal, because how are they going to justify it? So the seller's kind of in a bit of a bind. And if they don't lower the price down, they're going to be in a situation where they probably aren't going to get what they want anyway. So if it appraises for more than you're paying, my advice is don't rub it in the seller's nose. Just keep your mouth shut, thank your lucky stars, and move on with the deal. You don't want to tell them, oh, it appraised for X, Y, Z, and it appraised for a lot more, because then if you have to go back and ask for something down the road, they're going to say, well, you're getting a good deal anyway. We're not going to give you any break. You also want to make sure your prorations are done, and the prorations are the things that the landlord or the seller owes you for the time that they owed it. And that includes rents, taxes, utilities, and you want to make sure that all those are prorated. For instance, let's say you live out in the country and you have a propane tank. The propane in that tank, the seller, you're going to pay the seller for that propane in the tank. But let's say it's a rental property and you close on the 6th, the seller owes you for about 24 days of rent. And let's say it's June, the end of June, the seller also owes you for 6 months worth of taxes. And those are the things that you want to make sure are prorated at closing, and it actually reduces what you bring to closing normally. Things like propane in a propane tank or prepaid trash or cable, those are things that can actually be a credit to the seller and you'll have to pay the seller for. But you want to check the HUD. Now, the rules are changing and they're going to get away from a HUD here soon, but the HUD is for basically a definite short for housing and urban development. And it was a way to look at the transaction, and it's done over generally 3 pages. And it shows all the credits and debits to the seller and the buyer and helps explain where the money's going. You also will find that sometimes the property's got that you're interested in has an offer already in place. And if there's multiple offers on a property, the seller can accept one and offer to put you in what they call secondary position. Now, secondary position is not a bad place to be. I like secondary position because what happens is that if the first falls apart, and I find about 10-15% of the time, the first offer doesn't close for some reason. And if I'm in secondary position and it's a good deal for me, I can then move right in. So I don't mind writing in secondary position. Now, I don't hold my breath on that. I know that the odds of it are statistically, I won't get it. But being in secondary position does allow me to put a couple deals in place and be there just in case that first deal falls apart. And deals fail to close for a couple reasons, actually several reasons, but the primary ones are the inspection, appraisal, financing. What happens is that something's found on the inspection which scares the buyer, or the seller won't fix. The appraisal comes back and it's it appraises for less than they're paying, or the financing contingency doesn't go through. That can be related to the appraisal, or it can just be related to that their credit wasn't any good. We have seen a couple deals where the buyer or seller gets remorseful and just wants out of the deal. And sometimes that can be negotiated. Other times that can lead to lawsuits. So make sure you're not making offers on property you don't intend to actually buy. The types of titles, you can hold title in your personal name, depending on the state you're in. If you're in a marital property state, there's certain survivorship rules and regulations, and you want to do a little research and find out how you want to hold title to the property. If you can put it into your corporation right away, that's great. A lot of times what's going to happen is the bank's going to require you to buy the property in your own name, and then they'll allow you to transfer it to your LLC down the road. So you want to make sure that you've got the title in the way that you want it done, so that if you were to pass on, that the people who are left will be able to take possession of the property without having to go through a big court battle. So know the law and how it affects you, your family, and your business, because if something happens to one of you, you won't be around to help. Miscellaneous terms I'd mentioned, a attorney review, that gives you a little bit of an out. Home warranties. I like home warranties because they generally cost, depending on where you are, $400 to $600, depending on what they cover. And what it does is it covers you generally for a year, and it covers the things that you're not expecting to go wrong, things like appliances to break, or the furnace, or sometimes it covers roof or windows leaks, things like that. So I like to ask for a home warranty because it gives me a little extra protection, especially during that first year of ownership. A gap endorsement is something I always like to ask for, because when you buy a property, and let's say you're in a title state, there's different states, different types of way this is done, but in a state that does title insurance, the title insurance is done about 30 days prior to closing, typically. And if the seller were to then get a loan between the time the title work was done and the time the property closes, there could be an undisclosed lien on the property, which could create problems for you as the new buyer. The gap endorsement provides insurance and protects you in the event the seller does something unscrupulous, or if there's something that is undisclosed, whether overtly or inadvertently, that you're protected from having to pay that cost. You can also negotiate. Sometimes you can move in before the closing, or sometimes the seller will want to stay after closing for various reasons, and you can negotiate that all up front. You also want to make sure the seller generally has the right to correct defects, because if you find a problem during the inspection, it's always nice to have them actually doing the repairs. Now remember, The final counter offer along with the original offer is the final deal. That is it. It's not, oh, well, we're working on multiple counter offers. Whatever the final counter offer is, along with the original offer to purchase, that is the deal. Now, what I see sometimes on counter offers is people will reference a previous counter offer. That is just asking for it. That's flat stupid. What you need to do is relist all the terms every time you do a counter. So even if it's a whole page long, rewrite it on a new counter offer so there's no question that it's included. Because remember, if there's any ambiguity, it's generally drafted against or held against the person that drafted it. Now, what I like to do when I approach sellers is I like to know my game plan and know my numbers. And you got to determine who you talk to. On a listed property, you actually talk to the realtor, but on a for sale by owner, you talk to the owner. And you may want to involve your attorney. But remember, once you involve your attorney, and some states require attorneys to be involved, guys, some don't. If you require an attorney, well, you require an attorney. If you don't, then you can negotiate on your own, but make sure you put a contingency in that it's subject to your review. So if you have a realtor, it doesn't cost anything to make an offer, and the realtor will put the offer in. The realtor's paid a commission based on the purchase price typically. You can go around realtors, but if you've been working the realtor and they bring you a property, work through them is going to be my advice. If you find a property on your own, you're generally under no obligation to use that realtor. Now, if you have a buyer agency in some states, technically you're obligated to use them on any real estate deal you do. But you can also put in your buyer agency, not only that you have a cancellation right, but that any properties you find on through your own efforts are not subject to the buyer agency agreement. So you can go around realtors, but if the realtor brings the deal, don't hose them and go around them and try to work with the seller directly. You will get a bad reputation, and that is the last deal you'll ever see from that realtor or that real estate firm, because they will trash your reputation. So when you have an offer with a realtor, they're going to prepare your offer and present it, and make sure your realtor is representing you. Depending on your state, if it's a state like some in the Midwest where technically you represent the seller, or realtors represent the seller, even if they're working with the buyer, then you need a buyer agency to make sure that the fiduciary duty, the obligation is to look out for your best interest. The realtor will want you to offer a real good offer. Don't let that sway you. You need to offer something that makes sense on price, terms, and you need to discuss your strategy with the realtor. They need to understand that, hey, you're looking for something that cash flows. You're not going to buy something that doesn't cash flow simply to pay them a commission. Now, I wouldn't phrase it that way, but I'd say, look, the thing's got to cash flow with honest numbers. And we're not going to pay based on pie in the sky pro forma. And start 10% below your final price. And I often like to use a counteroffer strategy. If, let's say I'm offering $200,000, the $200,000 is my final price, I'll start 10% below that at $180,000. Then if I need to come up, I come up 6%. So I'll come up 6% at $200,000 or $12,000. And then if it goes to another counter, I'll come up another 3% or another $6,000. If it goes to a third counter, I'll come up $2,000. Because what I'm doing is I want to make my biggest concession first and then smaller concessions as you go forward. And the reason you do that is that it creates a situation where the seller starts to see that the deal's coming to an end. What you're willing to bargain and bend on is coming to an end. So they say, oh, 6% the first time, 3% now. So when you give them 1%, they're expecting it. They know that that's where you're going to be. But keep in mind that most deals won't work because most deals won't cash flow from the beginning. With the for sale by owners, make sure you speak with the seller directly and make sure that attorney clause is in there. Do not insult the seller's property. Be professional. If you find a problem with the property, discuss it in a professional and low-key way and show them how you came up with the numbers. Okay, this is where, we need to make 7% return on our money. We're looking for 7%. So when we back it into your numbers, it turns out that we can offer you $160,000. I know you're looking for $200,000. However, that doesn't allow us to make any money based on the actual numbers. So be polite. If you cannot come to terms, and keep in mind that in the majority of cases you won't, keep in touch. Be nice, be polite, and because first off, sellers know other people, and as you get a reputation, you'll get a reputation for being decent or being a jerk, and your reputation is going to help or hinder you. And some sellers will return to the table. I've had people come back 6 months, a year later and say, hey, would you still do that deal? And if it's still a good deal and the numbers look good, yeah, we'll do it. But if the property hasn't sold in 60 days, I'll resend the original offer. And sometimes the seller's a lot more flexible. Time makes people more flexible. So be aware that you want to do that. Now, land contracts, the land contract is the owner financing side. And basically the reason I like a land contract is if the seller likes you, that's often the extent of the loan application. What I mean by that is that if you're making an offer to the seller will go, okay, that's great, but do I trust this person? And if they don't trust you, you're going to be in big trouble, because what a seller is looking for if they're going to finance the deal is their money going to be in good hands? And why would a seller consider a land contract? A seller would consider a land contract because they can't get anything in the bank. There also can be tax implications. In many cases, a seller likes taking their money a little at a time versus in one big chunk because it doesn't change their tax status. They're not taxed as heavily on it. Also, remember, in a land contract, you can also offer 5-6% when they're getting less than 1% in the bank. And a lot of these people are, especially the elderly, are selling because they don't want to manage the property anymore. They don't want the hassle. They'd actually like to be more relaxed, but they're looking at that money as money to live on. Well, you're not going to live on less than 1% interest. So in some cases also, they would like to help out a new investor. You can tell them, I believe in honesty, and I say, well, I'm a new investor. We're looking to, start doing it just like you, and we want to be like you, and own multiple properties and things like that. And what you'll find is that some of these people own multiple properties, and if you do a good deal with them, you'll be the first one they come to when it comes time to sell other properties. So what types of people will do land contracts? Generally, I find it's the older people who have paid off properties, who are now looking for some cash flow. And they know that they're not going to get squat in the bank, and they want to just get out of owning a property. Now, managed right, properties are not a ton of trouble or a ton of management headaches, but you still work. It's not a freebie. You still have to put some effort into it. They want to do other things. But do not bring up owner financing at the first meeting. What you want to do is you want to get them to trust you, get them to know you a little bit, because that's how they're going to be more interested in doing land contracts. And keep in mind, most of the time they won't do it, but it's something I always ask for. But find out what they intend to do with the money, and they're normally putting it in the bank. So I always am looking going, well, wow, when you sell, you're going to travel. What are you going to do? Just going to stick it in the bank? Just have fun. Don't just be direct. So you're going to stick it in the bank and not make any money. Be relaxed and just talk to them about it and say, hey, so you're going to travel. What are you going to, you're going to use that money to retire on? And they'll often tell you. And what I'll say then is, really, so you're going to stick it in the bank. I mean, what's the bank paying nowadays? Well, it's horrible. I'm not making anything. I don't know what I'm going to do. Say, well, would you consider an option where I pay you the interest rather than pay the bank the interest? And many will go, I mean, what do you mean? I'm going, well, what I'd like you to do is, if you would act as the bank, I'll buy the property from you, and rather than getting a bank loan, I'll buy the property through you, with you financing the property, and I'll pay you the interest. And it's backed by the property. You already know it's a great property, and we'll put down a little money, and that's all negotiated out. So I'll put down some money. I have these ideas for the property. I'm going to make these repairs to make you more secure. So that way, in the unlikely event, let's just say things did go bad and you got the property back, worst case, you're going to have a nicer property. You're going to have your property back, and you'll be able to sell it for more money. And so you've got to understand what the seller's fear is. The seller's fear is that you're not going to pay them. So you've got to have an answer for that so that they're comfortable in even considering it. So I always say, I propose you sell me the property, act as a bank, and let me pay you the interest I'd normally pay the bank. I'd rather give the cash to you than in some big bank I don't know. And in some cases, they'll actually do it. So you need to negotiate on the price and terms. And remember, if you're negotiating, if they want a higher price, you want a lower interest rate. If they'll give you a lower interest rate, you can afford to pay a higher price. What you're going to find is that people get stuck on something. They'll say, well, I need this price. Well, then often you can come back with an interest rate that makes sense. For instance, they want $10,000 more than you want to pay, but you could offer them 1 or 2% less, and maybe they'll be fine with the lower interest rate if they get their price. So keep in mind that everything's negotiable, and that's something you want to do. So that'll determine how much you can pay for the property, how much interest you can pay. You need to know your numbers. You need to know what you need that property to cash flow in order to make sense. And then we can teach you how to back into the numbers and actually do well with the property. But I love owner financing. You also need to determine how the payments are going to be credited. If the payments, is, especially if there's a bank note, if there's no underlying mortgage on the property, then I don't mind sending the seller the payment directly. However, if there's a loan on the property, remember we have that due on sale clause we may have to contend with, but if there's a loan on the property, I don't pay the seller directly. I pay a title company typically, or an attorney, and I have the attorney make two payments, one to the lender and one to the owner. So they get the difference between what they have to pay in the payment and what they have to pay to the bank. Because I've ran into one situation where I was making the payment to the seller wasn't paying the bank. Well, guess what? The bank takes the property back, all the money I put in, I'm out, and there's nothing you can do. So if there is an underlying loan, be aware of that due on sale clause can cause you trouble, and be aware that you want to pay to a third party who then pays two checks, one to the seller and one to the lender, so that you don't get in that situation. So the payments are all made. You're making the payment to the seller. It'd be nice if you could be guaranteed that the payment was made to the bank. Now, when I'm talking about the land contract or any negotiation, usually what I'll do is if somebody will quote me a price, I'll just kind of flinch a little bit or blink, and then I'll be quiet for a little bit. And in many cases, the people will come back and go, well, we can do a little better. If they don't, I'll just be quiet for a little bit. A lot of people don't like silence, and that's a real negotiating technique, where if people don't like silence, if you remain quiet, a lot of times they'll start negotiating against themselves. So they want $200,000, and so you just blink and sit back a little bit and don't say anything. And in a few seconds or 20, 30 seconds, you sit there long enough, in many cases, well, we might do 190. And you can just, and you can play that a little bit. And when you think you got them where you're about as good as you're going to get, I'll come back and say, well, can you do any better than that? And sometimes they will. Remember, no ask, no get. But if a deal's good and you think you got it where it is, don't get greedy, don't get stupid. I've talked myself out of deals by getting greedy and stupid, and I've managed to make the seller mad over things like a couple of appliances or some furniture or closing date, something stupid. And I just talked myself out of a deal. I've made them mad, and they've sold it to somebody else who's gone on to make the money, and I'm back there kicking myself in the backside. So keep in mind that if you got a good deal, just shut up and do the deal. But do remember to negotiate credits for items needing repair. If it needs a new roof, you want to budget that in. If it needs new appliances, you want to budget that in, or get a discount on price. So you've got to figure what it's going to cost, and that's why you've got to look at a lot of properties, so you know what it's going to cost to actually fix these things. If you give something, you must get. That will help close the negotiation. If they ask for more money and you say yes, and don't ask for anything in return, they're going to ask for more interest, and then they're going to ask for something else and something else. So what I'll do is, if you ask me for more money, I'm going to ask for more appliances. Or if you ask me for more money, I'm going to ask for a lower interest rate, or I might ask for 6 months no payment. I'm going to ask for something, because if you ask for something every time they ask you for something, you're going to find it helps bring the negotiation to a quick end, because otherwise you're going to keep nibbling you until such time as it turns into a bad deal. And it creates a proper mindset for the seller saying, look, every time I ask, he asks. So it helps close the deal and come to a negotiated settlement that you can live with. Remember to escrow payments with a title company or a third party. Now, if the seller is hesitant, remind them why they're selling. Well, now you'd mentioned that, I know you're a little concerned about doing a land contract. What is it that concerns you? You're better off to know. Don't just guess what the seller's concern is. It might be something you can answer. Well, what is your concern? Well, I'm really not comfortable being the payment. Well, you did say that you're going to take the money and put it in the bank and you're going to live off that money, right? Right. Okay. Well, 6%, which is what I'm offering you on interest, is on $200,000 is $12,000 a year or $1,000 a month. Will that help? Well, yeah. Well, the bank's going to pay you 1% or $100 a month. Will that help? Or a couple $100 a month. Well, no. Okay. Well, there you go. So the reason you're selling is that you want to use the cash flow. Do you want to use up all your cash right away, or would you rather be able to spend the interest that I could pay you? So emphasize the cash flow to the seller and mention the poor returns on other investments. Talk about the property as security. If for some reason, always think about what the seller's thinking. The seller's thinking, well, what if he doesn't pay? And I'll address that. I'll say, well, worst case scenario, let's talk about it. If for some reason I didn't pay, you'd get the property back. And in most states, land contracts or contract for deeds come under something called strict foreclosure, which means it's a lot faster for the seller to get the property back than a bank would have. It would take a bank 6 months to 2 years to get a property back. In a land contract deal, in many cases, they can get it back in 30 to 90 days. So the seller is more secure that way. So I always recognize what their concerns are, and then I say something like that. So it's secured by the property. Here's what I'll do to make the property more valuable for you. Let's say it needs paint on the outside. Say, I'm going to paint the property as part of this deal. Okay. So what does that mean? I mean, that's a lot. That'd be a fair amount of money, right? Well, that makes that property just that much more secure. So remember, most owners aren't going to do land contracts, but you will find them that will. So make sure you tell them what you're going to do to improve it, because that secures in their mind that if they get the property back, they get back a better property than they sold you. If the property has that mortgage, remember that due on sale clause. And you can go back to module 2 in the free training. It's in the free training. It's in module 2 as well. And that'll take you back through that due on sale clause. But the way to get around that is using trusts, but that really requires an attorney to be involved, so that you want to make sure that's done right, because you don't want to screw that up. And always pay through a title company if there's an underlying mortgage. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to go ahead, just close that. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a quick 5-minute break and grab a cup of coffee or a tea or something like that. And then we're going to go ahead and jump right into the next module, which actually is one of my favorite modules. This is the inspection module coming up. And this is where we really talk about the things you got to look for in a deal. And when I show you what's going on and what to look for, you're going to love it, because it'll show you where to look on your first properties, making sure that you've actually done your due diligence. So let's take, I'm showing 2:11 on my computer clock. Let's take a 5-minute break, and we'll be right back here at 2:16. So I'll see you in 5 minutes. Okay, so we're back trying to stay right on schedule here to get us done on time, just like we promised. So what we're going to do is go ahead and jump on to the next slide set here. The all-important inspections. This is part I kind of love and like looking at properties and finding good deals. What you're going to find is that as you get into this business, it gets to be a blast. It gets to be a lot of fun. You get to be comfortable with it. You know your numbers. You know what's a good deal and bad deal. I can drive by a house in the neighborhood and tell you if it is if it's going to actually make some sense as far as a rental. But you still got to look at the numbers and things like that. But some of the problematic stuff that you're going to find, and this is critical, this is really what's going to make you or break you. You got to be good at the numbers, but you really got to be also aware of and learn to be good at inspecting a property and looking for issues, because the issues are what's going to be a problem. And some of the stuff that you want to learn to check are roofs, electrical, plumbing, HVAC, which is heating and air conditioning. You want to be looking for rot, insect damage, unsupported structures, leaks, and other environmental hazards. And we're going to go through these individually because each one deserves a little attention. And I'm going to show you some pictures of some of the problems that I've come upon. Pictures aren't the best, but they'll give you a little idea of what's going on. So on a roof, what you're going to find is that what you're going to find is you're going to find roofs that have missing shingles, curled shingles, snow and ice damage, ice dams, trees, gutters, and it can be expensive to repair. Depending on where you are, it can run $200 to $300 a square to rip off old shingles and replace. Now, what that means is that you're talking about a 10 by 10, a square of shingles is 10 by 10. And when you put on a new roof, I generally recommend you tear off the old shingles. The law in most places allows you to put a second layer of shingles on. I've come upon projects where there's 4 or 5 layers of shingles. That's a lot of weight on the roof. And frankly, you got to get all that crap off. So if that's the case, you need to know that. If you no more than 2 layers of shingles, generally I like to rip off any old shingles, repair any plywood, and put on new shingles if it needs a new roof. Curled shingles are a sign that the shingles are at the end of their life. And snow and ice can cause damage in that it creates ice dams. An ice dam is when the heat in the house rises and it melts the snow on a roof. And this is only, ice dams obviously only occur in the snow belt, but the ice dam, the water melts from the heat coming up from the house. It flows down to the gutter area where it refreezes because there's no more heat coming up, and it blocks that area near the gutter, fills the gutter and blocks it off. So now when snow melts on the roof, it comes down, it backs up against the ice because it can't roll off the roof, and it works its way back up under the shingles, and it gets into the house and starts causing damage. If there's any trees on a roof, you definitely got to cut them off. Trees banging on a roof will destroy the roof, and it also gives raccoons and squirrels access to the roof. And I'm going to show you a couple pictures here in a second of how those little critters can actually do some damage. You also want to make sure you've got gutters that are in good condition, because if you have water problems, which we're going to talk about in a minute, 80–90% of your problems are grade and gutter related, meaning your gutters are full of trash and they're full of leaves or whatever. They're not removing the water from along the base. The water comes down the gutter and drops right along the foundation. Well, that's just a recipe for disaster, folks. You got to get that water away from the property. And it can be expensive to repair. So do keep in mind $200 to $300 a square. But these are things that you want to talk to roofers about, so that when you look at a property and you see a problem, you start to know, oh, it's going to cost about a certain amount. Now, this particular property here is what happens when there's a lot of leaf and tree rubble on a roof. What it does is it starts to actually grow. Things start to actually percolate and grow, and it destroys the shingles. The curling shingles I mentioned before, this shows a lot of sun damage, and it's going to be a roof that's got to come off. There's no way to go over this. You can see these shingles behind it, next to it, are in good shape, but the other ones are in bad shape. So when you're doing this, I typically don't recommend just doing part of a roof. I recommend doing the whole thing. Now, if you look over to the top right, you'll see, look at this bulge here. You're going, okay, what's up with that? That bears some investigation. Down here on the left, the lower left, you can see missing shingles. This roof is at the end of its life. It can be patched, but you'll always see the patch. And in some cases, it just, not in some cases, in almost all cases, it looks horrible. So this is a roof that generally is going to need to be replaced. But this is one you see when you pull up. If you look in the bottom center, look at that sway in the roof. Years ago, roofs weren't built with trusses. They were just nailed up almost any old way. And what that does is over time, it's sagged. And there's really no way to fix this except to take the roof off and repair it. Now, I've owned properties with some sways and things like that, but just keep in mind it's going to limit your resale value quite a bit. And people don't like it because it speaks to a structural issue. It might have been that way for 100 years, but they still don't like it. Now, electrical issues, in newer properties, you're generally not going to have any electrical issues. You normally find it in your older properties. And what you find are knob and tube wiring. I'm going to show you a picture of that. But basically, it's an insulator, a glass insulator with a hole in it. And through the hole, it was nailed to a stud in the wall. And then the wiring was wrapped around it. That's how it was done years ago. They also use those old round screw-in fuses. I remember growing up, we kept popping fuses. My mother put a penny in there so that the fuse couldn't close. Well, good heavens, talk about an accident waiting to happen. But modern wiring is going to be 100 or 200 amps, and that's going to be listed on the box, generally on the main switch. So inside the breaker box, it's going to have what the amperage is. There's also issues with improper grounding, which unless you know what to look for, you're going to have a problem. But what you want to be looking for in your kitchens and bathrooms are ground fault interrupters. Generally, a GFI, it's called, is a electrical outlet that will prevent you from being electrocuted. Years ago in the kitchen, you put your hand in the water and then you reach for something to unplug an appliance and you get electrified and drops you on your dead. Well, nowadays, anything within 6 feet of water is supposed to be GFI. And I always, on an older property, I'll put them in if they're not there. Because what it does is if it senses that the circuit has been compromised, it'll actually kick off a circuit breaker and keep you from being barbecued. Now, what you'll see right here is this is knob and tube wiring. Look at this. You can see the little insulators are nailed onto the, in this case, the floor joist, and the wire is just wrapped around it. Very, very old wiring. In the center here circled, you'll see what they call a double tap. Now, a double tap is where they run two wires into the same breaker. That is generally a no-no, so you don't want that. And on the top right here, you can see this old box. Look at that old rust bucket. I wouldn't want to run any electricity through there. Sometimes in older homes, they also didn't put in a lot of electrical outlets, so you'll see, dozens of things plugged into one outlet. That tells you, in some of these older homes, I've been in older homes that have one outlet per room. And that just, you got to figure that that's not going to fly for most people. If you look on here in the center, you'll also see another double tap. And what I look at, it's a cloth type covering on your wire, not even vinyl, which is indication of very old wiring. And on the bottom right, you can just see a box with no cover. That's, anybody could stick their hand in there and be electrocuted. The wiring doesn't look in bad shape, but you got to have a cover on that box to prevent people from being harmed. Remember, if you don't do that on electrical, let's say you don't have GFIs, you leave the electrical cover off the box and the tenant sticks their hand in there and drops over dead, somebody's going to be calling you and you're not going to enjoy the call. So on plumbing, there's different types of plumbing: galvanized, aluminum, lead, copper, and PEX. I've seen them all. Lead is one of the older versions. Then they went to galvanized and aluminum. I don't care for lead piping or galvanized piping. You really have to learn to recognize it. And what you want to do is at some point when you start talking to contractors, many cases the plumber, just ask if you can follow them around when they're inspecting a property or when they're looking at your property or something else, and ask them if they can just talk to you about it, and they will. And you can ask them, what's this, how does this work? Remember, you're paying these people. I use them. I use them like a rented mule. I want to know what they're doing, how they're doing it, why they're doing it, because I want to be able to not only recognize a repair when I see it, but also maybe make the repair myself. The most modern thing right now is PEX. Copper is the second oldest, but copper piping, PEX piping, I love to see that. I have bought properties with all these other types of things. But do keep in mind that there are some problems with it. There's also some problems with metals interacting and things of that nature. But what you want to look for generally is leaks in joints. That's normally where your plumbing problems are going to occur. They're going to occur in your bathrooms, in your faucets, and where joints come together. You want to be looking for corrosion. You want to check the water pressure. Is the water coming out like I always joke, a baby peeing, or is it coming out like, a fire hose? You want good solid water pressure. Also, depending on where you live, you might have water softeners, you might not. Some places have water that's really hard, and suds don't suds up, clothes don't get clean. So know your area, know whether water softeners are mandatory, and make sure if you're buying a property in the rural areas that you have the septic systems and well systems inspected as part of the inspection and testing contingency. You absolutely have to do that. With wells, many times the government requires them to be inspected periodically, but you want to make sure that they're tested for E. coli, which is coliform, which is basically fecal matter. You want to test for things like some states require testing for arsenic, others for nitrates, some for pesticides. You want to know what's normal and customary in your area. Make sure that you test for it, because if there's a problem with the water, you can typically fix it through some different systems, reverse osmosis systems and things, but it can add up to a significant amount of money. So when we test for coliforms, nitrates, pesticides, herbicides, and we also have it tested and have the pressure pump tested. So septic systems and wells are going to create an entirely different set of issues for you. Now you'll notice here, look at this shower we had where the plumbing behind here was leaking and it just rotted out the wall. Now all that tile's got to come out for repairs. Here you can see a drain pipe. Well, obviously it's leaking. On the outside of this home on the top right, it actually rotted out the sill, and that all had to be repaired. Down below here, you can see where rot is coming through, water's been forming. You can look here and see this. We had to pull up part of the floor in order to get at the plumbing. You can see water damage everywhere, same here. So water damage is one of those things that if you see it, fix it immediately. Nothing will destroy your home faster than roof or plumbing leaks. Now on heating and air conditioning, there's two types of heating, generally speaking. Forced air and hot water heat. Forced air is hot air is blowing through ducts. And if you have a forced air system, it's also going to be what they push the air conditioning through as well. If you have hot water heat, that can be run through registers by the wall, at the bottom of the wall. It can also be run through the floor in some cases, and you have what they call heated floors. But what you're going to find is if you've got hot water heat, you have to have separate ducting for air conditioning, or you can't have air conditioning, or you have to use a window air conditioner. So those are the things that you got to be aware of. If you have window air conditioners, you might need multiple ones. They use a lot more electricity. Tenants tend not to like them. They tend to break, more frequently than a regular air conditioner. But you want to check the furnace and check for things like broken heat exchanger. That's where carbon monoxide is actually being allowed into the house. And you want to make sure that during the inspection that the inspector looks at the furnace and looks for rust, corrosion, make sure that the furnace has been cleaned on a regular basis and that it doesn't have cracked heat exchangers, because you don't want to kill your tenants. That really does cut down on your tenancy. You want to check your furnace efficiency. When you need to replace a furnace, you can get furnaces that are 80% efficient or furnaces that are 95% efficient. The difference in price will quadruple. So an 80% furnace might run you $2,000. 95% furnace might run you, $6,000–7,000. If the tenant's paying utilities, I never go with more than an 80% efficient unit. But even if I'm paying, I look at the cost, because fuel or natural gas isn't that terribly expensive. And I kind of do a quick analysis and see how much the difference is in heating. And normally these furnaces will have how much it costs to run a year. Well, if it costs $600 to run a furnace a year that's 80% efficient, and $400 a year to run a furnace that's 90% efficient, but it's twice as much money, it'll take 10 years to recoup my money. So you've got to weigh all those things when you're looking at repairs. You need to check the AC unit and determine if you've got central air versus windows. Furnaces are not terribly expensive to replace or repair. You can even buy used furnaces, which we've done on some of our rentals. But generally speaking, the furnaces start about $2,000 and go up, depending on what kind you've got. Now, what you're going to see here is in the center here, this is a forced air furnace. But when you look at this, see this, this is a forced gas water heater right here. This has a vent going into the furnace vent which is an absolute no-no. This is all taped together. This is carbon monoxide coming out of here. Boy, that'll kill you deader than a doornail if it gets into the house. In fact, over here, same thing. You can see this is just kind of ratted together. This is supposed to go vertical and then go out, not be vented out over the side on a horizontal, because that allows a lot of gas to escape into the house, which can be not so good for your health. This forced air furnace is older. It's bigger. The smaller the furnace, generally the newer it is. But take a look at the rust along the bottom. That tells you this thing's not long for the world. And this particular air conditioning unit has some real problems. I've seen this where actually animals, pets, especially dogs, have been urinating on units, and actually they destroyed the units. And this unit on the lower right is just an older piece of junk. It might still work, but it is definitely coming up for repair, or actually not repair, replacement. And the furnace in the top right is actually a hot water furnace. A hot water furnace is typically a lot smaller and looks quite a bit different. But once you see a hot water furnace versus a forced air furnace, you'll recognize the difference. You also need to be looking for rot. And the places you're going to find rot is where there's moisture. And those are your bathrooms and your kitchens. You want to look around the foundation where the dirt can be up around it. And when you're looking around the foundations, what you're going to find is, depending on where you live, some homes have basements, some don't. The basements are found, or frost walls, in areas where it freezes, obviously up north. In the Midwest is where you'll find homes with basements. You go out to Nevada, it's pretty rare to see a basement. So homes with basements, what happens is you typically see your rot along the base sills, along where the house actually meets the ground. Those are the areas where if the ground is too close to the wood will wick the moisture and it'll actually rot the wood. So what you can do is along the base of the house, you can use like a flat tip screwdriver and push into the wood around the base of the house. And if it slips in pretty easily, you've got rot. If it doesn't slip in, then it's probably solid. So these are some signs of rot you can see here. Over here in the center top is actually a windowsill where the window's actually leaking and it's actually bleeding the paint off. You can also see on the right here where the water is sitting on the sill and it's actually rotting the wood out here. I took a screwdriver, pushed right into that. You can see all these pictures are just areas of rot. In the center here, these gutters have leaked so bad it's leaked into the soffit and fascia area, and it's actually rotted out the wood because the water has been sitting there for so long. Now, pest damage is more typical in the south than it is in the north. Pests can be found in different areas. Carpenter ants can be found almost anywhere. Termites are pretty much a southern problem, but you can find raccoons and squirrels almost anywhere. So you want to recognize what pests are typically found in the area. And if you have termites or ants or something else, you want to get on a pest control schedule because it's a lot easier to keep them out than to get rid of them later. You'll spend an awful lot of time and an awful lot of money trying to get rid of them once they get in there. So let me show you what some of these look at. Take a look at this. Look at these chewed up areas right here. This area here, bottom left, that's either a raccoon or a squirrel. Same here in the center. Now, what happens is these raccoons and squirrels aren't stupid, and if they can get onto the roof with a tree leaning on it, they'll get in there and chew their way in, and they love living in a nice area like this. It's full of insulation. They can make nice nests. I've owned homes where I've trapped an entire family of squirrels out of my attic. I was in there and I just heard scratching in the attic, and turns out I pulled like 4 or 5 little squirrels out of there that were living up there just enjoying it because I had a hole in my roof where the squirrels were getting in. On the bottom right here, that was more like termite damage. Whoop, one slide too far there. Let's back up one. So here we've got more like termite damage. It looks like almost little mounds. It looks like little trails have been dug in. Same up here. You can see these holes in the top center and on the right. That looks like termite damage to me, and it's something that's going to need to be rectified, but you want to make sure that you're treating for pests in advance. What I've also found in a lot of older homes are unsupported structures, meaning years ago there were no building codes, so anybody could do whatever they wanted. And I've seen people build property and just put blocks on the dirt and put a house on top of it. I'm going, are you insane? But, no footings, no structures, no stability whatsoever, but it happens on a regular basis. And what you'll see is when you look at a roof line, it'll have that sway like I showed you earlier, or they'll have, you go into the house and you drop a marble and the thing rolls to a corner. It'll have uneven floors, or you look at the door, you look at a door in the house and it's all canted. That's generally because of unsupported structures. Now, times it's been that way for 50 years. Other times it's not, but it's because the footings are not there. Footings being the bottommost support measure, or support mechanism. Generally, it's concrete poured into the ground upon which everything else is built, and they either don't have any footings or not enough. Also, the basement beams can be undersized. The addition could be done without proper knowledge. So many people don't know what they're doing when they build. But here on this particular one, look at this one we saw. First off, it's sitting on a block, and not only that, it's sitting on a piece of wood on top of the block on the dirt. This was an addition. And you can see here the beams actually snapped. So this thing's moving and settling. You can see in this brick, if you have brick and it's cracked like this, there are some issues with this. I wouldn't touch this with a 10-foot pole unless I knew exactly what was causing the problem. On the lower left, you can also see concrete cracking and things that can be settling. And these are drywall cracks. Now, sometimes in older homes, you'll get these drywall or plaster cracks. It doesn't mean there's a huge problem with the home. It just means over time the home is settled a little bit and it needs to be repaired. If it comes time to repair drywall, repairing drywall isn't easy, but it's not the end of the world. Repairing plaster is a much more tough job. Now, foundation and major leaks, if you have major leaks in the property, you want the seller to fix that thing, or you want to buy this right, because major leaks can destroy your property in no time. But most leaks, if water is getting in under the property into the basement, it's almost always because the grade is what they call a reverse slope, meaning instead of sloping away from the house, the ground slopes toward the house. Or the gutters and downspouts are either not there, or they're trash and full of trash, and they're allowing the water to fall back down, allowing the foundation. Now, a lot of basements will have what they call sump pumps, which are a system which, if any water gets around the foundation, it'll pump it out. But a lot of times these sump pumps, the outlet is right, it comes out the sill of the house, meaning it's right by the foundation, and it only extends 6 inches. So the water comes out, drops right next to the house, flows right back down, and creates a vicious cycle. So you need to be aware that the ground's got to slope away from the house. Gutters and downspouts need extensions and need to be clean. And if you've got problems in the basement, normally that's going to be why. It's because of the grading of the gutters. But it can also be, I live in a neighborhood with a high water table, and the house that's one over from us sits on a spring. And this thing, I don't care if we're in a drought, their sump pump is running all the time. It's like they got their own little well in their basement, and that's not a situation I want to get into either. So if I'm looking at a property and it's got a sump pump that's running all the time, I'm not going to touch it. But to repair it, repair the gutters, redo the grade, and generally that's going to take care of the leak. If it doesn't, you can put something into a basement called a drain tile system and a sump pump. A drain tile is basically, they bust out the concrete. Now, this is not a cheap fix, keep in mind. They bust out the concrete around the inside of the foundation, and they dig it out, and then they put in a tube. And the tube has holes in it, and it's covered in cloth. And the tube has little holes drilled in it, and any water that gets in the foundation works its way into the tube and then flows via gravity to the sump pump, which then pumps it out. And that will generally repair a leaky basement permanently. But make sure that whoever does it is experienced and gives you a lifetime guarantee. What you can see here is these basements. These are basements here. You tend to have fewer water problems. Your water problems in houses without basements tend to be right along the grade where the ground hits the wood or the siding, or up on the roof. But in these particular ones, these basements, what you can see here is obviously if you've got water flowing in, it's probably coming in through this door. You can see here water is working its way under the wall. Here you can see signs of water in the lower left where water's been working its way into the window or weeping into the wall. Now this is a brick foundation. Brick foundations are not as waterproof and not as stable as poured concrete foundations. A lot of older homes have brick, but you'll often see that there's some issues with it, cracking and things of that nature. If you see that, you want to have a basement expert look at it because that can be a real problem. And this one in the bottom center, this is actually a lake down here. The sump pump wasn't working and the basement filled up with water. But in many cases, if you look in the lower right, this is where you find a lot of water getting in, because what happens is in many cases, these window areas, these brackets around the window that provide a little space between the window and the ground are actually sinking in, and the ground now slopes back toward the metal. The water works its way in through the window, and the next thing you know, you got wet basements. Some environmental hazards to be aware of are Chinese drywall. Chinese drywall was a big problem several years ago. It's mostly been taken care of, but the only way to fix that is to tear it out. And that's it off gases, toxic materials. If a house has Chinese drywall, do not touch it unless everything's been replaced. But some other environmental hazards are oil tanks, lead-based paint, radon, asbestos, and mold. And we're going to talk about each of these in turn, and we've mentioned some of them before. But oil tanks are interesting. And years ago, natural gas lines weren't buried. In fact, there were no natural gas lines. So if you're in an area that requires heat, they had tanks. And those tanks could be in the basement in some areas. They could be outside, buried in the dirt. They could be sitting on a pad outside. So the tank can be located either in or out of the home. The problem is more so on those that are buried outside or that are above ground outside, and that if they leak, any leakage goes right into the dirt. If it's in the basement, if it leaks a little bit, it at least leaks onto the concrete typically, which is a lot easier to clean up. But if it leaks into the ground, it creates an environmental nightmare. And you've got to get those old tanks out of there. If there are old tanks in there, you want to make sure that they've been professionally removed. In fact, if there's an old tank, you want to go to your environmental protection agency in your state, find out what the rules are for getting rid of old oil tanks, and require the seller to do it. That's because I ran into a situation once where I was fortunate enough that I required the seller to do it, and the tank broke and spilled oil everywhere. So it was a huge problem. I'll tell you a little bit more about it in a second. But old oil tanks normally aren't in use anymore. Fuel oil is still used in some areas, but generally speaking, if it is used, that's fine. Continue to use it. But make sure if the tank is buried outside that you have that tank inspected and that there's no problems with the tanks. If there is fuel oil, make sure that the tank is on something called the keep full so that the tank doesn't run out of oil and then the tenants don't have any heat. And make sure the tenants realize that they got to keep that tank full. Most furnaces now burn natural gas, which is a lot cleaner and a lot less environmentally damaging. But what you'll see here is a few pictures of some tanks we've dealt with. But for instance, on this lower right, you can see they're digging this tank out. And on one of the properties we bought, in fact, the first property I bought in '87 from my World War II buddy, he actually had tanks in there, and he agreed to take them out. And he hired a company. Thank God for him. He hired a company. They took out the tank. It was full of oil. They didn't drain the bloody tank. So they picked it up with a backhoe, and it busted in half. And it dumped hundreds of gallons of this heavy fuel oil into the hole. And the contractor was on the hook. It was over $50,000 to remediate it. They dug out, I don't know how deep it was. It was like the Grand Canyon till they got done digging out all the contaminated soil and replacing it. It was $50,000 that the contractor had to eat in order to fix it. So these are just some pictures of fuel oil tanks. This one on the top left you can see is leaking a little bit. It's probably leaking out of the valve. So if it's in use, what I would do is get it repaired. If it's not in use, make it a part of the offer that the seller is to have the fuel oil tank removed and professionally remediated according to state standards. You want the paperwork on this. If it's done professionally, it's done according to the state requirements. Make sure you get the paperwork from the state stating that it was done right so that they can't come back on you. If you buy a property, the fuel oil tank or something like this, and later there's an environmental problem, you're personally liable. So you want to make sure that any tanks are removed if they're not in use, and that it's done in a professional manner and it follows all the state and federal regulations. So you need approved contractors to do this. And when you do that, you protect yourself from losing $1,000, $50,000 in $87 down the road. Now, lead-based paint is another thing. In the Midwest, most states don't require you to do anything with it. They just require you to paint over it. If the exterior of the house is older and it was painted with lead-based paint, you can side over it and it's not a problem. However, some areas require you to take it out, and that is a very expensive proposition. So you need to know what's required in your state and just assume that the rules are going to get more and more strict. But lead-based paint was was available prior to 78. It started to phase out in the 60s. And the reason lead-based paint is a problem is kids were eating it. They were chewing on window sills and things like that, or people were sanding it, it was getting into the air, and it creates neurological damage, especially in children. So what lead-based paint looks like is, if you're looking at for lead-based paint, if you paint over a wall and then the paint cracks off in big pieces, typically it's because it was painted in lead-based paint years ago. Or it will look like a jigsaw puzzle where it's got tons of tiny cracking. And that typically says that at some point that was painted with lead-based paint. I'm going to show you a couple pictures of that here in a second. So it's primarily an issue for children, and it causes neurological damage. There have been some huge court case awards. So you want to make sure that you're following the regulations regarding disclosure. In our area, we typically just have to encapsulate it or paint over it and provide a lead-based paint brochure, and we're covered. So local regulations can and do vary. I know in the Northeast, some states do require to remove all this lead-based paint. So you bloody well better plan on it, and better have the seller do it if you can manage, because that is something you do not want to get into, or you definitely want to have a firm price on that. So either removal or encapsulation are the two methods. Now on the bottom center here, you'll see where they're scraping off all this old lead-based paint. These guys are in these white suits. Do you think that comes cheap? I can pretty much guarantee it doesn't. But in the top left, you can see when I was talking about the paint's flaking off in big pieces. That's because at one point this was painted with lead-based paint. And you'll see it around windowsills in both of these pictures on the top. But you can see this checkerboard pattern in the lower right here. But this was painted with lead-based paint at one point and painted over with like a latex or an oil-based paint. And that's what lead-based paint does. It's what it looks like. So when I see that, I'm pretty sure that it's got lead-based paint. If your area has strict lead-based paint rules, then you darn well want a lead-based paint test done, and you want to make sure that you've negotiated who's going to take care of it. If, like where I'm from, they're not very touchy about it, and you can just paint over it or side over it, then I don't typically worry about it too much. But be aware, because that's one of those things that can really kick you in the teeth. Radon is a problem in some areas. Radon is a colorless, odorless gas that they believe causes cancer, and it's measured in something called picocuries. And anything over 4 picocuries is considered an environmental hazard. If it is over 4 picocuries, there are ways to remediate it. For instance, if you have radon gas is heavier than oxygen and air, so it settles into the lowest level of the house. But if you have a home with a basement and there's going to be a radon problem, they're going to put the test down in the basement, because that's where the radon is going to settle. And if it has a radon problem, you can ask that the seller fix it as part of the deal. And typically what they do is they just put in a system which creates vacuum underneath the slab on the basement floor, and it draws out the radon before it's able to get into the basement, and it's then vented out of the house. All right, so it's found where you find granite rock. So just check with other investors in your area. Your investor club will know. Your home inspectors will know if radon's a problem in your area. Excuse me. So you want to make sure to limit exposure to radon. 4 picocuries is the maximum. And with basement, it's really easy to remediate. It generally runs, I found it runs from $800 to $1,300 to remediate it. But what the heck, if you find it during a test, I like to make the seller pay for it. Excuse me, getting a little hoarse here. So all homes have mold, and mold is caused by moisture. Just be aware that, you know, a certain level of mold is going to be found in every house. People panic. Some states don't even have regulations for mold inspection, like the Mitten, Wisconsin, where I do some work, doesn't even have a mold remediation statute. Mold inspection is kind of in its infancy here. You go out to Nevada and other areas in the Southwest, or there are and Northeast, there are very strict rules, and you'll find different regulations. So where to look for mold, you typically find it in bathrooms and kitchens and in basements and crawl spaces. And it's normally not a problem, most mold, because most mold is, you know, how do you think they make penicillin? So most mold isn't an issue. It only becomes an issue when it's in high concentrations. There are a few types of mold that are seriously dangerous. And I've walked into homes to look at homes, and I've actually turned around and walked right out. And let me show you what I'm talking about. If you look in the lower right here, now I'm not sure if this is the most dangerous kind of mold. This means there's water somewhere in the wall somehow. But when I see this kind of black mold, I get real sketchy about buying that property, because I'm going, what is causing that problem. And in this case, you really got to take the drywall out, the plaster, and rebuild it and find out what the problem is. I've been in homes that have been stripped of the studs where they've had to take out every inch of drywall and all the insulation because they had such a mold infestation. The top left here, you can see here, this is actually a shower area, and it doesn't have a vent in the shower. And so what happens is moisture builds up and it creates some mold on the ceiling. You can't keep paint on it. You're constantly cleaning the mold off. In the center here, you'll see where there is some mold underneath this sink. That's probably due to a leak. That type of thing doesn't scare me. Same on the bottom left here. You can see where the shower's got some mold. Typically what that means is there's just water leaking out of there a little bit. It might need a new seal. Those types of things don't bother me too much. But when I see a lot of water problems like over here on these bottom two right, I get a little hesitant about buying that thing unless I can basically steal it because I know I'm going to have to spend a fortune. Asbestos causes a serious kind of cancer, and it's kind of a whitish type material. It can also be more of an off brown. I'll show you some pictures so you've got an idea what it looks like. But it was used extensively in older homes as an insulator. It was used, if you watch any TV, you see they're advertising for mesothelioma, which is a cancer that asbestos causes, and for people who worked in the shipyards and people who worked with asbestos, because it causes a cancer that's pretty much incurable. But asbestos in itself is not a problem. It's only a problem when it's inhaled. So when you find asbestos in a home, there's a couple things you can do with it. You can have it professionally removed, which does cost good money, and you want to make sure you know what it's going to cost prior to making your offer. Or in some areas, we simply encapsulate it, which means it's wrapped in another material and it's simply left in place with the attitude that it's more risky to take it out than to leave it in place. It was used extensively in siding, flooring, insulation, and in pipes years ago. It hasn't been used since the 60s, but you will find it in older homes. So encapsulation and removal are the two techniques. Now what you'll see here, you'll see this as kind of a, my apologies, hit the wrong button. That happens. Alrighty, so you'll see here in the top that sometimes you hit the wrong button twice. So what you'll see here is this is an insulated pipe with a whitish type material. That is asbestos. You'll see the same down here in the center. This is an asbestos heating duct. You'll also see asbestos insulation sprayed in. Over here on the right, this is called vermiculite. It's a little bit different looking. This is a loose insulation. We just did a house, just got finished a couple weeks ago, that had vermiculite that we had to take out. But on the bottom here, you'll also see old tile. Actually, some of the older homes will have tile siding on the side of the houses, and that's usually asbestos based too. So a lot of people say, well, we're just going to take that off. Well, if you take that off, you can trigger a lot of environmental regulations. So in some cases, what we just do is it's just easier to go over it and just nail siding over it. So keep in mind that asbestos regulations aren't that difficult to comply with. A lot of things had asbestos, but be aware that it can be in things you wouldn't expect. So if you find it in things like the insulation and things of that nature, either encapsulated or budget for its removal. And when you're making repairs, you got to conserve cash. Nobody's in an endless fountain of cash. And what you need to do is, here's how you prioritize your repairs. First off, you pay for items that protect the property. If the roof is leaking, nothing else matters. Fix the bloody roof. Then you need to do things that make the property rent ready. Like if it needs a floor in the kitchen, you put the floor in. If it needs a countertop, you do that. If it needs new lights, you put those in. Third, you put in items that allow you to raise rents. What I like to do is I like to make my property equivalent to what other properties are for those class of tenants, whether that be A, B, C, or D tenants. And then I like to do something just a touch nicer. What I mean by that is that I might put in a nice dining room fixture. And by nice, I mean, instead of spending $50 on a dining room fixture, I might spend $150 on a dining room fixture. So just the basics, what they expect, and something a little nicer that you can point to that differentiates you from other people. And as you make these repairs, if you're under rented, if you're not getting market rate rent, and your property needs a few updates, what you want to do is make those updates so that you can actually get the rents up to market. You also then want to use your home warranty. If there's a problem and you have a home warranty, for instance, your water heater dies and you have a home warranty, typically what you pay is a $75 service charge or $100 service charge, and it doesn't matter what it costs to fix that appliance, they take care of it. So that's why I really like home warranties. You need to take care of leaks on the roof and in the plumbing and in the basement, quick like the money, because those are the things that will break you, especially the roof and plumbing leaks. The basement, if the basement gets a little wet, it can create a mold issue long term. Tenants don't like it. It creates smells. It's something you want to cure, but it won't destroy the property near as fast as a roof or plumbing leak. So those you've got to be on immediately. Do not, if there's a leak in a property, I tell the tenants to call us immediately, because, I mean, if the faucet's leaking a little bit and it's leaking out and it's dripping into the sink, all right, that can wait. But if it's leaking out from under the sink, then I want to get over there and take care of that. So leaks are critical. You also need to take care of electrical issues, because those are safety issues. And remember, when you have tenants, you're responsible for what goes on in that property. And if anything ever goes wrong and it goes to court, they're going to look at were you reasonable in what you did. So take care of any electrical issues. That means ground fault interrupters, open electrical boxes. Issues with the electrical need to be taken care of, because that will cause you some serious problems if somebody's injured through injured or killed through electricity. Typically, people don't get killed by a plumbing leak, but they can very quickly be killed if the electrical does not function properly. Other issues to take care of are sidewalks and stairs. If somebody falls on your sidewalk because they weren't clean and snow belt, or that they're on level, you can expect a call from their attorney. If somebody falls down a set of steps because you didn't have a rail, guess what? You're going to hear from their attorney. So you need to take care of the things that can get you into trouble, and make sure that the property is well maintained, because keeping it maintained is a lot easier than fixing it up once you let it go to heck. So update the property to the level the tenants expect. Do not over improve, the standard plus a bit extra, and only improve the vacant units. What I mean by that is, if I got a 4 unit and I've got one vacancy and it needs some repairs, I'm going to go ahead and repair that unit. I'm not going to offer to repair all 4 units. I'm only going to typically do that when the tenant moves out. However, if I have a long-term tenant and they want us and we want to do something for them to get them to stay, we might do an improvement for them. But generally, if people are paying the rent and not complaining, we don't typically put any extra work into their units, just enough to keep it maintained and tenantable. You want to paint, you want to put in new flooring, kitchen countertops. These are the things that don't typically cost a ton, but can make a big difference in getting it rented. Also, a little nicer fixture in the faucets, as I'd mentioned. You're better off to spend $50 on a faucet versus $20 and not have to touch it again for another 10 or 15 years. You want to make sure that the curb appeal is up, because if I've had people pull up to old buildings I've owned that I haven't fixed yet, they pull up, they slow down, and they keep going. Well, that's bad news from a rental perspective. If they don't want to rent it because it looks like heck, that means I got a problem with it. You want to cut out old overgrown landscaping. Female tenants especially do not like a lot of brush and other things around the front doors and other areas, because a perpetrator, a rapist, and somebody could assault them and they can't see it coming. So make sure that this overgrown brush along the buildings is taken out, and especially around the front door. If you have old trees or new trees, frankly, planted right alongside the foundation, get them out of there. Trees will wreck your foundation. Big bushes can wreck your foundation. I like low profile landscaping, and I like grass. If you're in the north, I like grass. If I'm in the southwest, I like sand, because I don't want to have to do a ton of landscaping. So get those trees out, make sure the grade is adjusted so any water flows away from the home, and make sure the plantings are low profile. And don't put in a ton of plantings. Plantings you put in these stone beds or these bark beds, they require a lot of maintenance. And over time, I've learned I want it to look good. I don't want to have to be out there working on the landscaping to keep it looking good all the time. And landscaping is expensive. So I landscape, I put in a few nice plantings up front, and along the side, I might put in 1, maybe 2. And other than that, I use grass or sand, depending on where I'm located. So you want happy tenants, and you want a good lease, and you need to set the expectations, rules right from the get-go. And we're going to go through leases here on the next section, but leases can run anywhere from a couple pages to 10 or more. You want to make sure that the lease is applicable in your state. If you go online and just download any old lease, it may not hold up in court, and you may find yourself in big trouble down the road for not complying with state law. What I like to do is buy a lease from a real estate investment association or an apartment association in my market, because those will typically have all the new lease clauses in that comply with local regulations, or I'll contact a real estate attorney in the state and ask if they've got a lease that complies with all the regulations, and just pay them once to buy the lease from them and then use that for my tenants. You also want to make sure it complies with the local regulations, because sometimes municipalities have regulations that differ from the state regulations, and your lease does have to be compliant. You also need to enforce the rules. Now, what I tell my tenants, I say, look, I've got a 6-page lease, but I can tell you in 3 sentences what I require. It says, pay your rent on time, don't destroy the place, and don't disturb the other tenants. If you do those things, we're going to get along swimmingly. If we don't, there's 6 pages of things that tell you what you can and can't do and what we can do to rectify it. So if you follow the rules, we're going to get along swimmingly. We'd love to have you as a long-term tenant, but we do enforce the rules, and we do expect tenants to abide by them. And make sure you treat tenants fairly and even-handedly, because tenants have rights, and you don't want to get into a situation where you're not enforcing the rules on one person and then trying to enforce them on other people. And that can actually line you up in a tenant resource center challenge or in a court case. So you want to make sure that you're treating everybody the same. And I like to find out if my tenants are staying or leaving early. So I'll ask them 90 days out if they want to renew their lease or not. And if they're interested in staying, I like to determine if they're a good tenant. And we're going to talk about that in the next module. I rate them from a 1 to 4. If they're going to be moving, I go over any items that need to be fixed to get back their security deposit. And I always play it like we're going to give it back 100%. Do not promise to give back their security deposit, because you don't know how they're going to leave the property. And security deposits are regulated and often by state and federal, or state and local law. So make sure that you know what the rules are. In our area, for instance, we can't withhold from a security deposit to clean a carpet, but we can withhold for things like damage to the unit. So you want to make sure you know what you can and cannot withhold for on security deposits, because tenants in a lot of areas know their rights and they will enforce them. And so you're expected to know as a landlord. But I like to show the unit early. And if I have leases that are all ending, let's say in June, summer market where I am, where I work primarily, is one of the better rental markets. But if I've got everything coming due in noon on a 4 unit, I don't want them all coming due in noon in June. So when I renew my leases, I might renew one for 10 months, one for 11 months, one for 12 months, one for 13 months, so that I never have more than one vacancy at a time. It helps with the cash flow. You don't want to get in a situation where everybody decides to move at the same time. It creates a crimp on your cash flow, and it also creates a situation where you got to get 4 units ready to go. Now remember, tenants are the lifeblood of your business, so treat them decent, but they are responsible for the damage. Believe it or not, the reason for tenant turnover is not rent or rent increases. It's management and maintenance not being responsible or responsive to their requests. Rent increases are down the list of why people move. I like to do an exit interview. I like to find out, why are you moving? Are you looking, well, we're buying a new home. Well, there's not much you can do about that. Well, we don't like the neighbors above us. Well, that's good to know. Or the utilities are too expensive. Well, that's good to know. And I like to part as friends when possible, because I've had people come back, they've had a bad experience with another landlord, and I consider myself a good landlord. They come back and they rent from me because they know what they're going to get. You want to be advertising online, and I like to use the free services, including Craigslist and Backpage. You can also, in some cases, put it on the MLS through a realtor, but if you do that, they're going to charge you. There's also offline methods, newspaper, penny saver, flyers, real estate magazines. I don't typically use those anymore. I typically rely on Craigslist and Backpage, and I've had pretty good luck. I've also had good luck referrals from a tenant. If I have tenants, I say, look, if you have another tenant like you that is looking for a nice place to live, we treat you right, let us know, and we'll give you a half off a month's rent. Well, heck, in order to get a good tenant, am I willing to give the tenant that sends them, one of my existing tenants who sends a good tenant to me, half a month off? Absolutely. If I can get someone out like them that pays on time, doesn't cause me any grief, I'm all about rewarding them, and you should be too. Now, schedule your showings when most people are off work. That means typically after 5 o'clock or on the weekends. And I invite everyone at the same time. What I mean by that is a lot of people when they're new will say, well, you come at 4, you come at 4:30, you come at 5. Trust me, half the people who say they're going to come don't show up. So you've just wasted a drive. And now you're angry. But if you invite everybody to come at the same time, it creates a sense of urgency. And it also is more efficient on your time. So when I've got a unit vacant, I'll say, okay, we're going to show the unit at 5:30 on Thursday evening. And I'll tell everybody that. And I've had 10, 15 couples in some cases show up. And what it does is they're going, oh my God, this is a hot unit. I better get an application in. So it creates a sense of urgency, and you want to have applications. And I actually take deposits for the unit right there, and I'll take multiple deposits. But what I'll tell people is I'll say, look, we're taking deposits, but what we'll do is we'll send your check back. We won't even put it in the bank. We'll send it back without cashing it if you're not selected for the unit. And people go, oh, that's great. But I want to take them off the market. When they give me a check, it means they're serious. It means they're off the market. But you also do not want to mess around. You want to go ahead and get determine which tenants you want and get that done quickly. Excuse me, quickly. If you drag your feet and you wait 3 or 4 days, a lot of these people, if they're seriously looking, will have gone somewhere else. So have the applications, take deposits, but also don't wait until repairs are done. If I've got a unit that needs, let's say, new countertops and new carpet or paint, I'll actually show the unit. Be careful, you don't want people falling down the steps or something like that. But I'll show the unit when it's under repair. I'll actually show them my people are working on it, because I want them to see the prospective tenants going, saying, oh my God, what a great landlord. He's out there fixing up his units, taking care of it. This is the type of thing I can rely on. It also allows you to short circuit it. So rather than wait until the unit's done, I can be showing the unit, taking applications and choosing a tenant. So when it's done, they can move in right away and I'm not missing any rent. So have the applications pre-printed and ready to go. Have pens and clipboards, multiple ones, and get the tenants to fill out immediately. Collect a deposit from interested parties right then and there. Then review the tenants. You want to do credit checks and background checks on everybody. If you do it on anybody, you got to do it on everybody, or it's considered discriminatory. Now, credit checks and background checks can be run through a number of services. Ask your local apartment association or other investors, and they'll give you a tip. Your attorney can probably do it, and they'll run searches. Typically, they run $15 to $20 a search, but you got to check everybody. I also like to talk to the previous landlord. You need to know what the local regulations are. Some local regulations won't even allow you to ask for social security number, which makes a background check much tougher. It's still doable, but you've got to be a little bit more careful. But get on it immediately. Check for criminal history and make sure that you're not letting someone in there who has a history of abusing children, sexual crimes, or drugs. If you let people with sexual crimes in, all your good tenants are going to leave. If you let people with drugs problems in, all your good tenants are going to leave. Now, they need a place to live, but frankly, you're not a social worker. You're not in the business of doing that. And if you do decide you want to be in that business, you are going to be out of business so fast, it's going to make your head spin. So when you select a tenant, make sure they have decent credit or lots of cash. I've taken people who are in bankruptcy as tenants, and they've been good tenants. But what I've said as well, because of your credit history, we're going to require the first 2 months rent and the last 2 months rent and a security deposit. And in many cases, they'll say, fine, we'll do that. But I either want cash or good credit before I'm going to rent to somebody. And I don't rent to people who've been evicted in the last 5 years. Typically, I don't rent to people who've been evicted ever, because if they've been evicted, it means they not only couldn't pay, but they forced the landlord to force them out. But if they've got a foreclosure or a bankruptcy or a short sale, I typically don't hold that against them as long as their credit was good in the past and is good now, or they've got cash. So no sexual crimes, no drug offenses. And then I notify the tenant I've selected that I'm going to take them as a tenant, but don't tell the others you're not taking them yet, because a lot of times those tenants will have gone somewhere else, and the tenant you would have accepted as a second tenant has now gone, you told them they're not going to get it, and your first tenant doesn't take it. So notify the tenant not selected after you have the cash from the first tenant in the bank account. Then what I like to do is, if they're a good tenant, I'll say, look, I don't have anything now, but I might have something in the future. Can I keep in touch? And in many cases, they'll say yes. But otherwise, I send a letter. There's just form letters you can get that just says, well, you weren't selected for the unit. You don't want to say too much. Typically, I just, like in my area, I just have my attorney draft a letter that they weren't selected. Cost me $50, and I've got a letter that I can use for any tenants that we didn't take. So if there's a good secondary tenant and I got another unit coming up, I'm darn well going to try to get that tenant to take that future unit. So when I tell someone they got the unit, I meet and I get cash immediately. I get first month's rent, I get security deposit, and it's either cash or cashier's check. No personal checks. And the security deposit check, which they gave me, in many cases, I'll give them that check back and have them give me either cash or a security or a cashier's check. I'll even meet them at their bank and get the check, because no one moves in until the money is in the bank, because I've taken personal checks and the check is bounced. Now somebody's in your unit and it might take you months to get them out depending on local regulations. But it is important to take the tenant off the market, because good tenants are in demand and other people are going to be looking at them as good tenants as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a real short break here, and then we're going to go ahead and finish up with the last module. Let's take a break. It's 3:10. Let's take a break to 3:15, and then we're going to go ahead and finish up the last module and get you started on your path to real estate success, and get you rolling here so that you can get busy buying your first property. So we're going to go ahead and get rolling again with our final module. I know we're covering things that lickety-split. Remember that you can go back and use the online course to review. We also gave you an electronic copy of the book. If you didn't get it, you can email us at support@tommeetzel.com. That's support@tommeetzel.com. It's TOMMIETZEL, tommeetzel.com. And that's also our website, tommeetzel.com. So if you have questions or if you couldn't get something, just email us at support and one of our people will get back to you and send you whatever you couldn't access. So don't worry about it if you didn't have access, but we sent you a copy of our book on how to start over, our 14-day investor book. We've given you access to our free online course, and we've given you our profit calculator. We've given you our lifestyle design calculator as well. So we hope you enjoy all those things. So let's whip into the final module, and we'll be wrapped up on time as promised. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen here again, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the lease, protecting yourself with a lease. There are a lot of lease sections, but we're just going to skim over a little bit some of the things you're going to be looking for. And the lease is going to tell where the property is, what's the rent, how much discount, if any, they get for paying on time. It's going to talk about the security deposit and other items. But the residential lease starts off with basically a statement. It would say something like, this residential lease is made between the landlord. And if you're renting it as a company, if you own it on an LLC, make sure it's the company's name on the lease. In that when you sign the lease, you sign as in your name as member of, XYZ LLC. You do not want to sign personally. You don't want your personal name on these leases if you're using a corporation for the ownership vehicle. It's also going to have the term on the lease and how long the lease is for. Most leases go a year. Remember, if all your leases are coming due at the same time, stagger them. That way you won't have more than one turnover in 1 month. It'll also tell you how much the rent is going to be and what the penalty is for paying late. Now, there's two ways to do it. One is if they don't pay on time, you can charge a penalty. The other way is if they pay on time, you can give them a credit. I've done it both ways. I don't see a ton of difference. People seem to like the credit better than the penalty. So I might say the rent is $700. If paid after the 5th of the month, it is $675 if paid before the 5th. And that way it creates an incentive for them to pay on time. But either way, have some type of clause in there that either gives them credit for paying early or penalizes them if they don't pay on time. Also make sure that the security deposit complies with your local regulations or state regulations, because they do vary. Their lease is also going to talk about what happens if their check is bounced. Generally, what I say, if you bounce a check to me, from then on out, for the first bounce check, they pay the bounce check fee and we let it slide. But that's usually $30 for a return check. Second time, from there on out, they have to pay with a cashier's check, which is a real hassle for them. But if they bounce a second check to us, we're done taking their regular checks. It talks about the lease duration, also who pays the utility. Now, if you buy a property or you're looking at a property that has utilities that the owner pays, for instance, heat, electric, what you want to consider is it possible to separate the utilities inexpensively and let the tenants pay their own utilities? For instance, let's say you're charging $750 in a 2-unit, so you're getting $1,500 a month, but you pay for the heat and the electric. Well, how much would it cost to put in a separate electrical box and let tenants pay for their own? Well, what I like to do is, okay, the electricity is costing me $150 a month. What I'll do is I'll take half of that and I'll credit it to the tenants. For instance, if I'm paying $150 or $75 a unit, I'll say $75 of that I'm going to credit back to the tenants. When I separate the utilities, I'm going to keep $75 for me as additional profit, and also to pay for the updates. So I'll say, okay, each tenant's going to get $37.50 credit. So I'm tell the tenants when we renew the lease that we're separating utilities and that they're going to have to pay their own electricity, but we're going to lower the rent $37 a month to accommodate that. So if you're going to separate the utilities, you're probably going to have to give some kind of a rent credit. But I find that when tenants are paying your own utilities, they use a god-awful lot less utilities than if you're paying them. Another method is you can also back bill and meter utilities. That's a little beyond the scope of what we're doing. It's typically done in larger apartment complexes. but it is something I did want to bring up. But you do need to agree who is going to pay what utilities, and on the lease, what law controls it. Generally, any lease is going to state subject to the laws of XYZ. That's the state where you're actually located or where the property is located. What happens if the tenant abandons the property, basically just disappears? What about guest policies, how long they can stay? I've had people who say, well, they got guests staying and it's basically a second person living there, and that's not something we allow. If a person's been there typically more than a week out of a month, we typically want them on the lease. Also, how are maintenance and repairs handled? Where do they call? What are their responsibilities? What about tenant damage? What do they pay? Can the tenants make any alterations to the unit? Let me give you the Reader's Digest version. No, the tenants can't make any alterations to the unit. And who's responsible when a guest misbehaves, and what tenant conduct is considered acceptable and not acceptable? And do we take pets or not? Now, keep in mind, if the person if they're blind and they have a guide dog, we don't have any problem with that. If they have a service dog of some type, generally the law requires you to allow them, and we typically don't have a problem with that. Sometimes you can charge a little extra rent because of that, but do be aware that you can't exclude pets that are considered service animals. It'll also say that the use of the premises is for residential purposes only. It'll talk about the conditions of the premises. It'll say that the tenant has to give you notice of any issues in the unit within a certain number of days. I like to walk through with the tenant and do a check-in form and a check-out form. But when I do a check-in form, I bring my camera. I make sure that I take a video of the entire unit just walking through. I make sure that the video shows them in the unit, so they can't say, well, we weren't there. That way you're covered almost 100% if it ever goes to court. Also, it talks about right to enter, that if there's a problem in the unit, there's a plumbing leak in an upstairs unit, tenant's not home, the downstairs tenant calls and says, hey, there's water coming in through my ceiling, that you can get in and repair it. Who does the repairs and maintenance, and in what time frames, things like that. There'll also be sections on terminating the lease, subleasing, where the tenant wants to move early and they want you to allow them to lease it to someone else. Typically, we require them to pay for that service, and we require that they still remain liable if the person to whom we sublease does not pay. You want to protect your investments, and that's what the lease is for. So make sure you do the move-in, move-out procedure and document the damage. And also, you want to have a default and validity clause in your lease. A default clause says what happens in the event the tenant doesn't pay. And it's also a validity clause that says if any part of this lease is considered invalid, that section shall be struck. All other parts of the lease shall be considered enforceable. Otherwise, if any part of that lease is said to be invalid by a court, they could void the whole lease. So you've got to have a validity clause in there. This is a typical default, and it says the tenant will be in default of this residential agreement if they fail to pay the rent or fails to fulfill any term or condition, abandons the apartment, makes an risk misrepresentation. It'll list what's considered default. Property management is the key to success, and it's really going to determine your long-term experience in real estate. But finding and keeping good tenants is a critical fact. I suggest that you manage your own property to start with, so you learn what you're doing. Ultimately, you'll probably want to get professional management, but you need, whether you're managing or somebody else, you need to stay off the government radar, because if tenants start complaining about the way you're keeping property and things like that, and you start to get a proctological exam from the government, it gets to be expensive. It gets to be a hassle, if nothing else. And it will determine property management, whether you make money in this business or lose money. So self-manage in the beginning, but do not tell the tenants you're the owner. Remember, we talked about that earlier in the program, where you're the manager versus the owner. That allows you to appeal to higher authority and come back and say, sorry, the manager's not going to go for it. And you need to treat it as if it was your job. Do not get close to your tenants. I've had investors who started dating tenants. Oh my gosh, talk about a nightmare. At that point, there's no way to get them out. What are you going to do? I mean, boot out your girlfriend or boyfriend? I don't advise it in neither. So be even-handed and fair. Don't get close to the tenants. Treat it like a profession and treat them professionally. Now, when you go to professional management isn't necessarily better. Frankly, nobody cares about your property like you do, and they're going to charge you a fee for it. And in a smaller property like a 2 to 4 unit, they're going to get 8 to 12% of the gross rent. So it can be a significant amount of money, but it does free you up from having tenants call you. They call the management company and you're off the hook for it. Now, the management company is not only going to take 8 to 12%, they're going to arrange for any repairs or maintenance on the property. And they're not only going to charge you for those repairs, they're going to take a markup on that. And the markup can be typically 15 to 30%. So if the job costs $20 an hour, they're going to mark it up to $23 or $26 an hour, say, or $29 an hour, and you're going to pay that as part of it. So management companies can be an expensive option, but you need to know if they're doing a good job, and that means you need to be checking your numbers every month. They need to be providing you with reports every month on tenant turnover. You need to be occasionally checking with the tenants to find out and surveying the tenants via mail what their feeling is about the management company, things like that. You want to make sure that the management company is being wise stewards of not only your property, but your money. Sometimes they don't care. I've had management companies that just spend like drunken sailors and just keep spending, and I don't get a check at the end of the month. I get a bill. Well, as you can imagine, when I get a bill at the end of the month, when I'm expecting a check, I get a little cranky and I find out why. And generally it's because the management company isn't doing a good job on managing the property. So manage yourself to begin with. And when you're choosing a management company, I like to use referrals, landlord associations, or real estate group, because those are the places that other people are having the same issues as you, and they also have management companies, and they can tell you about their experience and who they like. I also don't like a management company that owns their own properties, and let me tell you why. Because what do you think is going to happen? You've got a vacancy in your unit, and they're advertising for you, which they'll charge you for, and a good tenant comes in the door, but they got a vacancy at one of their units. I've seen all too often on scrupulous property management companies that the good tenants all seem to get funneled to their units and the crappy tenants all get funneled to mine. And in the end, I've got a bad property with a lot of management headaches and expenses while they got a golden property. So I don't want a management company that owns their own properties because I consider it a serious conflict of interest. Now, 8 to 12% to manage. And how much do they charge? Some of these places will charge 1 month rent to find a new tenant, plus they'll charge you for the advertising costs. And I'm going, are you insane? I'm not paying you a full month plus advertising. If I got to pay you a full month rent, you're paying for the advertising cost and all the expenses of finding that tenant. Generally, I'll pay for the advertising and I negotiate a small fee of, $100, $200, $300 to find a new tenant. But remember, it's all a negotiation. And until you know what a reasonable expense is, you won't be able to negotiate. Make sure you negotiate the markup on the maintenance work, who pays the advertising, who pays for the tenant screening, and what your requirements are for tenants living in your property. You can say, okay, we won't take anybody who's at an eviction like I won't. We won't take anybody that's had a foreclosure or a short sale or a bankruptcy or a credit score under 600. So you can set your standards for that and make sure that they're following it, and make sure that each month they're sending you a rent roll, an income and expense sheet, and an operating budget for the property. But be sure to speak to other clients and drive by the other properties they manage. I ask, when I am interviewing a management company, I ask for a list of several of the other properties they manage, and I drive by because I want to see what they look like and how are they being taken care of, because how those are being taken care of are generally how yours are going to be done. Some property managers, which also have like CPMs, it's called, certified property managers, and that typically means they've gone through significantly more training than the average property manager. In most states, anybody can hang out a shingle, or a realtor can call themselves a property manager, and they don't have to have any special training or certifications or insurance or anything else. So be aware that property managers do vary all over the board, and that is going to impact your return on your investment. Now, I categorize my tenants based on desirability and how well they pay rent and how easy they are to manage. And I believe in getting paid necessary for the work to manage a tenant. But a couple things I will do is I have more flexibility. For instance, when I have tenants calling me who are 20 years old, wanting me to replace a light bulb or something like that, forget it. But I've had old tenants and that call me and they're 80 years old. I don't want them climbing up on a ladder. I find that elderly, handicapped, mentally or physically, are often extremely good tenants. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, don't discriminate based on anything. What you're looking for is a good tenant. I don't care what color they are, creed. I don't care where they're from, what their background is, what their sexual orientation is. Are they old, handicapped? I could care less. What I want is somebody who pays the rent, doesn't trash the place, and doesn't disturb the other tenants. And I find that the elderly and handicapped typically are very good tenants. So don't be afraid to rent to them because they tend not to move very much. They tend to pay rent on time. And I find that they tend to be very desirable tenants. But in general, I rank tenants as 1 through 4. Category 1 tenants are highly desirable. They pay on time, which I really love, and they almost never bother with maintenance requests. And if they do, it's something significant. It's not something insignificant. I've had tenants replace faucets and everything else at their own expense who are category 1 tenants and not even think about it. I've had tenants stay for a decade. They're just wonderful to have that. I don't want any complaints from other tenants about these tenants. They're quiet and respectful. And what I try to do is give them a minimal rent increase, typically in just enough to cover, say, any increase in taxes or operating expenses, because they're good people. And these are the kind of tenants you want to keep happy because they make your management easy. Now, category 2 tenants usually pay on time. They require a little more. I wouldn't call them a nightmare. They're just a little more hassle. I consider them acceptable, but I like to keep their rent at market rate, meaning if the rents have gone up in the area 5% that year, they get a 5% increase. So I do a rent survey each year, and I increase the rent based on what a typical unit would cost. Most people aren't going to move over a few bucks, and that is where you want to keep them. So you want to keep them at market rate for category 2. Now, category 3 tenants are a different story. They rarely pay on time. They're usually late. They're demanding. They're a little whiny. They're messy. They don't keep the property up. They may cause a disturbance on occasion. They're difficult to deal with. And there's 2 options with these people. And I'll either give them a very large increase. And I basically look at it this way. If I'm going to put up with them, put up with their BS, I'm going to get paid for the trouble. So charge them. So if the rent's $700 and a normal rent increase might be $25, I might raise them to $900. If I'm going to take the extra grief that they're going to incur in my life, I'm going to get paid an extra couple $100 for the trouble. So keep it in mind, either a very large increase or don't renew them at all and send them back in. Just don't renew their lease. Now, category 4 tenants are the ones that have to go, and I've had some of those too. These are people who don't pay, who are involved in criminal activity, who are just trashing the place, who are a nightmare. Other tenants are complaining. They're bringing down the value of the property, and they're chasing out good tenants. So I don't renew their lease, and sometimes they'll leave, sometimes they won't. I've even paid tenants to move. Believe it or not, I've had some tenants who are so bad, I said, look, if you leave the property in good condition, don't do any damage, and leave, I'll give you $250. And in some cases they will. It's a lot easier to pay them a few bucks to leave than to have to go through evicting them and having them trashing your property on the way out the door. So I like to part as friends, review the property prior to move out. So I do a pre-inspection with the tenant and tell them of anything that's damaged that they got to take care of and have repaired. But be fair with the security deposits and only deduct for access, wear, or tear. But be sure before you send back the security deposit, utilities are paid. If you are responsible, that if they're not paid. If it doesn't matter, if the tenant's responsible and they can't back bill you as a landlord, who cares? Not your problem to do that. But if they can back bill you for anything, make darn sure that anything they can back bill you for is taken care of. So the utilities need to be put in your name if you don't have a new tenant moving in right away, because the last thing you want to do is have your electricity or the heat cut off, depending on your climate. Also, then I like to meet them and get the key turned in, and a final walkthrough of the property to make sure that it's clean and ready to go. Now, depending on where you live, security deposits are going to be regulated. In some markets, 21 days, other places that's different, but make sure that you return the security deposit in the time allowed. Otherwise, the tenant can be entitled to double or even triple damages in some place. But refund any balance once you verify that the expenses are paid. Any non-payment of rent, anything that any damage is done is taken out. Now, if there is more damage than you can actually get from their security deposit, you can send them into collections. You can send them a bill. First thing you do is send them a bill, and in some cases they'll actually pay it. If they don't, you either can send them into collections or you can take them to small claims court. My experience has been that it's pretty tough getting money out of blood out of a turnip, as they say. But your tenant problems are going to generally boil down to non-payment, damaging the property, and criminal activity. And non-payment, damaging property, or criminal activity, you simply got to evict them, or you've got to encourage them to leave. Like I mentioned, I'll sometimes pay them a small amount to have them exit the property so I can re-rent it to somebody who's more desirable. Keep in mind that local regulations can affect what you can and cannot deny tenancy for, what procedure you have to go through to get rid of bad tenants, even people who've committed criminal activity. Noise is another area that you find problems with. And if you have noisy tenants, hopefully they're better to be on a bottom floor. Noisy tenants, people who play their stereo too loud, you need to get on this and don't tolerate it, because one bad tenant in your building can chase out all the good tenants. And for heaven's sakes, why do you want to allow crappy people into your units who are causing everybody else to move and chase out the good ones you want? So you need to put your foot down and not tolerate this stuff. But that goes back to a good lease and enforcing the rules. So you don't want people who are bringing your property down. Now, if people aren't paying, you got to get them out quickly, because you're losing cash daily. And after 2 months, it's unlikely you're ever going to collect. So for non-payment, you need to file a 5-day notice to pay or vacate. No excuses. I don't care what it is. And you got to charge late fees, because if you don't charge late fees, if you waive any late fees, what you're going to find is that they're going to be late all the time. And you need to proceed with the eviction. If they decide to pay, that's great. But if they don't, at least you're not wasting any time. Now, getting out non-paying tenants can be quick. Like out in Nevada, it can be a few weeks to get somebody out so you don't lose much rent. In other places, it can be a several-month process. So the key is that you've got to follow the rules and you've got to get it done quickly. And once again, you can send them into collections or small claims court. I find typically that I just send them into collections, because I've won in small claims court many times. I've never really collected any money. And if the security deposit does not cover the damage or loss, remember to send them a bill before proceeding with any other process. Now, if the tenant damages the property, they must pay, and they pay 100%. Typically, if the ordinances allow in my state or local, I like to charge $25 to $100 as a service charge for coming in to take care of different things. It just discourages them from calling for minor stuff. But you need to repair broken or damaged items promptly, because it protects your investment and it limits your liability risk. If you have a staircase that broke off and then you knew about it for a month and you didn't fix it and somebody falls, you don't have much of a leg to stand on when they come after you in court. Also, some areas have what they call rent abatement, which means if there's a problem with the unit, the tenant doesn't have to pay any rent until the unit's fixed. Now, this can lead to some kind of game playing with the tenants, but generally, if there's rent abatement, you do need to keep on top of the any repairs. And remember what is and what is not an emergency. And fire, flood, or blood, I consider an emergency. Everything else can wait till the next business day. Now, if they only have one toilet and a toilet's non-functional, well, that's an emergency. If they have no heat in the winter, that's an emergency. If they have no air conditioning in Nevada in the summer, that's an emergency. Especially for older tenants too. I mean, you got an elderly person, your air conditioner goes out and it's 115 degrees. Yeah, you actually got to take care of that. So fire, blood, and flood, you got to notify the proper authorities right away, first thing. Do everything you can to minimize any damage to the property and notify the insurer. Anything you can do to minimize damage, like if you had a roof collapse or something like that, getting a tarp over it, whatever you can do to minimize the damage at reasonable cost is going to be something that the insurer is going to want you to do. So in order to protect your assets, you need proper insurance. You need to work with your agent, and do not ever mislead or lie to your home insurer, because if you do and they find out the time you need your insurance, they can void your insurance. And the next thing you know, guess what? You've got no insurance. So it's on your nickel. Make sure you've got the proper corporate structures. We like LLC. We don't like properties in your name. There's also different rules for different LLCs. For instance, some states do not require you to set an LLC up in your name, which makes it, from a liability protection, a better deal. Keep a mortgage on the property. What happens is that if you get a paid off property, now I'm all about paying things off, but if you have a paid off property, it becomes a nice little target for these contingency fee lawyers. If you got a $300,000 multifamily paid off, even if there's a corporate structure, they're far more likely to come after it than if there's a mortgage on it. For instance, let's say there's a $200,000 mortgage on a $300,000 property. Well, until they pay all the legal fees and everything else, there's not enough money for them to get. So a lot of investors, myself included, will actually keep a mortgage on a property to make it less attractive should anybody want to come after the cash in that property. But know your regulations, because I didn't know is not a defense with any local, state, or federal bureaucrats. Yes, government agencies can be a real hassle if you don't follow the rules. Now, if you're not mechanically inclined, make sure you have arrangements for subcontractors in advance. The time to call a plumber and talk about rate is not when there's water pouring out of the bottom of your sink. You want to do that in advance and make sure what the rate is going to be, agree on the rate and how fast they can get there, and watch the contractors do the work and learn the basics. Because in many cases, you can do it yourself, especially if you don't have a lot of property, and that saves money and allows you to better manage your property. Tenant rules, make sure you have noise policies and quiet hours. You have rules about parking and vehicle repairs. Who's responsible for lawn and snow care? Remember, if the tenant's responsible for lawn and snow care and it doesn't get done, the state or the local city is going to send you the fine. They're not going to typically send it to the tenant. They'll typically send it to the owner of record, which means you. In that case, I bill it right back to the tenant and make them pay it. So make darn sure they understand who's responsible. If they're not responsible for it and you're taking care of it, that's fine. But if they're responsible, make sure they know it. Make sure you have rules about overnight guests and the tenant's responsibilities for those guests. I have rules about the locks. Can they change them? I don't like to have tenants change locks because what if you've got to get in for an emergency? But that said, you should rekey your building on a regular basis. Usually when tenants turn over, I'll rekey because you don't know where the old keys are, and you don't want to be in a situation where somebody gets their home broken into by somebody using a key who used to live there previously. You want to have rules on painting. Generally, I say no. I've never, shouldn't say never, but almost never had good experiences with letting tenants paint. I've had tenants paint only as high as they can reach. I've had tenants paint in black. I just find a no paint rule is a much better one to live by. And also window coverings. I typically provide window coverings, blinds in my units because I don't want to drive by and see blankets hanging in the windows or them screwing window coverings into my nice hardwood trim and not doing a good job of it. So I'll generally provide a blind system in the home so that they can't, and I tell them that they're not to put up any other window coverings. Who's responsible for cleaning the carpet? I like to make the tenant responsible when they move out. Who's responsible for any other damage, or what's the tenant's cost share on that? What kind of pet policies do I have? Do I allow pets? If you have pets, you should be charging an extra security deposit and extra rent. I call it kitty rent or doggy rent, and it's $20 to $50 a month. Cats, I want dogs and cats spayed or neutered, and I've also found that cats, if they spray, they can do enormous damage to a property. So be aware that I'm actually more of a fan of dogs than I am of cats, because while a dog can destroy a carpet or something like that, or even some other types of flooring, they're generally not going to destroy as much as a spraying cat. But be careful with your pet policies. I don't like big dogs. I don't allow dogs that are considered vicious, pit bulls and things of that nature. I typically like small, I guess what I'd call little yappy dogs, but I don't want them yapping, disturbing other tenants either. And also you'll find, especially with older tenants and tenants who live alone who have pets, they'll stay a lot longer if they can have a pet. But just make sure you have policies in place that protect you in the event the pet does damage. How to handle maintenance requests, how repairs are made. But government regulations are one of the last things I want to touch on today. And that's a significant cost of doing business. And there are tenants can cause government issues with landlord-tenant associations or local branches of government, building inspectors and others. I've had tenants who don't want to pay rent call a landlord association or a building inspector trying to create a problem for me so they don't have to pay rent or trying to delay paying rent. Well, if you stay on top of your maintenance, generally that's not going to be the case. And if I have tenants doing that, they quickly move into the category 3 or 4 tenants, and they either pay a lot more rent or they're sent packing on the next lease renewal, because that's not something we're going to tolerate. But try to stay off the government radar, because ignorance of the law is not going to protect you. You also want to maintain good records and know and follow all local regulations. Now, there are some overarching federal regulations on things like lead-based paint and anti-discrimination and asbestos, things of that nature. Then the state has a layer of regulations, and they tend to be a little more intrusive, but both state and federal regulations change pretty slowly, and they're easy to keep on top of. I typically don't have problems because state and federal regulations go through quite a review process, and there's a lot of vested interest on the state and federal level. And so those things change slowly, and typically they're fairly easy to comply with because you have plenty of notice. However, what you're going to find is that local regulations can change fast, and it varies depending on the area of the country. So there's local regulations. You can have big government local regulations or small government. Typically in liberal-leaning states or states in the Northeast, some in the Midwest, who have left-leaning governments and kind of nanny state policies and procedures, you're going to find a lot more regulations for landlords. States in the Southwest tend to be much more, and the South tend to be much more landlord friendly. So do be aware of that and know your local regulations, because those can change often. And in many cases, even in my market, the landlords are often seen as the bad guy. I don't know why that is. I think it's typically they consider all landlords to be rich, and they hate the rich, even though many of them are rich, and they feel that you should be punished because you're a landlord. So the regulations can be broad to petty and minuscule. In our market, some of the regulations go as far as what kind of lights you have to have on the outside of your building, what kind of light bulbs you can use, what kind of locks you can use, all kinds of different things. So you want to stay off the radar, but if there is any trouble with local officials, basically I recommend the two following words: shut up. Take what they tell you and call your local attorney or your real estate association and get some advice, because you don't want to say the wrong thing with these people, because these are bureaucrats and they could care less about what you think is right, what you think is wrong. It only goes to what they think is right and what they think is wrong. So what I'd like to do is talk to you very briefly about our coaching program, because what you realize is that get off that screen share here. As you can see, what you're dealing with when you're buying property is somewhat straightforward, somewhat confusing. I've tried to give you an enormous amount of information. Obviously, I've been doing this for almost 30 years. I've got a lot of experience. I can't basically dump my brain into yours in the 5.5, 6 hours that we've spent together. So for those who are comfortable going it alone, good on you. Good luck to you. And if you have any problems in the future, let us know. For those of you who are a little less comfortable with that, we do offer a variety of levels of coaching, including private coaching and group coaching. But I wanted to talk to you briefly about our private coaching program. And I'm going to open a window on your computer right now, which will show you a little bit more about our private coaching program. Now, our private coaching program is a one-year program. And what it does is it takes what you might have problems with. This is things like locating property, calculating the financials, working with tenants, all these types of things. And we basically help you and handhold you through it. We provide 2 phone calls a month where you talk to me privately, individually, either as an individual or a couple if you're married. Also, what we do is we provide you with our group coaching program as part of our private coaching program. And every month we do a group coaching call. We also provide you with different forms and things that you can use in your real estate purchasing, other ways to help calculate what you're going to need. And we also turn you on. We have people who actually sell properties, investment properties, so we can hook you up with properties in various states that actually make sense from an investor standpoint. But what we do is we take you through the process and make sure that you don't make any expensive mistakes. Now, that doesn't mean you're not going to make any mistakes. Everybody does, and it's part of the learning process. But what we want you to do is to buy your first investment property and be comfortable doing it. And we have a program on our private coaching program. It's usually a 6-month program, but for those on the call today, we've extended it to 12 months. And I've also set it up so that you will not be working with anybody else but me on the coaching program. The coaching program is normally $59.97. That's for a 6-month program, but we're doing a 12-month program for $49.97, or 3 payments of $17.50. We know, $5,000 is a lot of money, but honestly, I've made $5,000 mistakes many times. When I started in property, I had a little bit of guidance, but I've made mistakes that have cost me hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that's very discouraging when you're starting to get into the business and you make expensive mistakes, because not only is it discouraging and it impacts your cash flow, but it also creates a situation where you may not want to stay in a business that could really create a lifestyle that could make you financially secure, that could provide a legacy for your family. So rather than going out and stumbling your way through it, even with the knowledge we've been able to provide you, some people are going to want us to actually take them by the hand and walk them through the process, speak with them on a regular basis, and we actually give you unlimited email access to us. So you can email me questions every day, and I'll respond every day personally. We speak twice a month on the phone. We give you group coaching. We provide more online coaching. I send you videos on a regular basis on how to inspect properties, on how to interview lawyers, on how to interview bankers. We go through this soup to nuts. So we stay with you for 12 months and until we get you your first investment property. So what you're going to find is that $49.97, it's going to cost you more on the learning curve, we find, than the $49.97 on your first property, because you're going to miss some things that we would have caught for you or helped you catch, or negotiate a better price for you, things of that nature. So people tend to find that they make it back and more on their first deal with us. And after that, it's all gravy. All the knowledge we've imparted, everything we've taught them, they save money, they make more money on all their future deals. So we've given you 2 options. We've put a couple testimonials in there. We've also got a guarantee. If after speaking with us, you don't feel comfortable with us after the first 30 days or so, we'll simply let you off the hook, refund 100% of your money. If we're not the right coach for you, we're not the right trainer for you, you don't feel we can guide you successfully, we don't want your money. We don't want you to have a bad experience. We'll simply refund it. So I always believe in treating people right and doing the right thing. And if I'm not the right person for you, then please, whether you use me or somebody else, I suggest you get involved in real estate. Spend the money to get a mentor, find a mentor, something like that, so that you can actually be successful and enjoy this business versus struggling. While $5,000 is a lot of money, you're going to find that in the greater scheme of things, it's a pretty inexpensive investment. That's why we've also made it 3 payments of $17.50, just in case that makes it a little bit more comfortable for you. So we will be keeping in touch. We're going to send you a replay of this video. We're also going to go ahead and send you some videos down the road here to help you get started, even if you don't sign up for our private coaching program. We'd love to see you successful. We'd love to hear about your successes. And you can also email me directly if you have any questions about our program at support@tommeetzel.com. That's support@tommeetzel.com. Also, what we're going to do on the chat is I am going to put up and post the link in case we opened a new window on your browser, but just in case that didn't open properly for you, I just put on the chat screen a link to our coaching program. So check out what our other students say about us. Check out our guarantee. Go ahead and get signed up, and one of our staff will be contacting you to set up your first call with me. In addition, since you've held on through the entire program, I'm going to offer you a free 30-minute strategy call. Just email us at support@tommeetzel.com. Put strategy call in the heading and put down your name and contact information, name, address, phone, email, and one of our staff will contact you and set up a call so that you can speak directly with me, and we will help put a plan in place that you can implement to begin your real estate career and you're prospering in real estate. So thank you so much for watching and hanging with us through this webinar. And we wish you all the best success, and we look forward to working with some of you in our private coaching program. And be sure to look for some of our videos that are going to be coming your way in the near future. So have a great night, and we look forward to talking to you all soon.